Chapter 412. Elizabeth looked at Eric's non-negotiable expression and wrinkled her nose unwillingly, but she still nodded with a light snort. Eric showed a satisfied smile. Although this girl was used to being stubborn, she was becoming more and more docile. This was a good sign. Then the two began to discuss the specific cooperation plan. Unknowingly, the afternoon passed. Elizabeth looked at the gradually darkening sky outside the window. She put down the notebook in her hand and said, "It's not early anymore." Eric also turned his head and glanced at it. He nodded and said, "Well, it's okay. It's not dark yet. I've been busy all afternoon. You won't kick me out without eating, right? I'm afraid you'll eat something else after dinner." Elizabeth blurted out in dissatisfaction, but she immediately regretted it. Her face turned red, and she stood up in a panic. I'll go ask Julia to prepare your dinner." Looking at the girl's back as she ran away, Eric smiled, got up, stretched and moved his muscles. He tidied up the scattered documents on the desk, walked to the sofa, and comfortably picked up the remote control to turn on the TV. He casually watched a Warner cable TV movie. The sky was completely dark. There was a gentle knock on the door. Julia stood at the door and said, "Eric, it's time to eat." "I'll be right there." Eric turned off the TV, stood up and walked out of the study. There was already a sumptuous dinner in the dining room. Eric pulled out a chair and sat down. He looked at Julia, who was dividing the dinner for the two, and asked, "By the way, are you really going to give the little one that name?" "What?" Elizabeth was a little confused. Eric said, "Drew told me that you're going to name the little one Emma Roberts Murdoch." When Julia heard this, she looked at Elizabeth nervously. Elizabeth might have misunderstood Eric's meaning. She glared at Eric and said, "So what? Anyway, don't even think about it." Eric asked rhetorically. "Don't think about what?" Elizabeth said, Don't even think about adding Williams to her name. Emma is my and Julia's baby." Eric picked up the cutlery indifferently and cut the sausage in front of him. "I never thought about it. It's not like it's my child. I'm curious. If this matter is exposed, how are you going to explain it to your father? Are you going to tell him that you've come out of the closet?" "That's none of your business," Elizabeth said weakly. Eric shrugged and lowered his head to deal with the dinner in front of him. After dinner, Elizabeth consciously began to clean up the table like a docile little wife. Elizabeth went to the nursery to see the little guy under the care of the nanny, and then ran to a small living room in the villa to watch TV. Eric didn't move. He sat in the dining room connected to the kitchen and watched Julia clean up the cutlery. He asked, "With Emma, you definitely won't be able to take on any movies in the short term, right?" Julia scrubbed a plate with a plastic ball and said softly, "Anyway, the money I have is enough for me to use for a long time. At least until Emma is 1 year old. Then I'll start working again. If it really doesn't work, then I'll be a producer with Liz. I think you're more suitable to be an actress. Actually, I have a few ideas that are suitable for you." Julia glanced at Eric and said, "You're always bullying me. I don't want to work with you anymore." Eric sighed exaggeratedly. "Can't you change the image of me as a demon king in your heart?" "Demon king." Julia repeated Eric's words and chuckled. "You really know yourself." Eric also smiled and looked at the girl not far away. The March night in Los Angeles was still very cold. Julia was wearing a light yellow close-fitting sweater and a pair of white casual pants that accentuated her slender and straight legs. The sweater seemed to be a little short. As the girl bent over, her slender waist was exposed from time to time, giving off a faint sexy aura. Sensing that Eric was looking at her without restraint, Julia cleaned the cutlery faster, as if she wanted to escape from Eric's sight as soon as possible. However, she soon found that Eric stood up and walked over to her. Julia subconsciously wanted to escape, but she realized that she was like a rabbit that had fallen into a trap. After a while, Julia said, "Eric, you'll be seen." Eric didn't mind being seen by Elizabeth, but he remembered that there was a nanny watching over Emma in the villa. If she found out, she would sign a confidentiality agreement in time, and it wouldn't be leaked. However, it would still be awkward. Thinking of this, Eric stopped. However, he still whispered in Julia's ear, "I'll take Liz back to her room first." Julia's little head was in a daze, and she subconsciously nodded obediently. It wasn't until Eric left the kitchen that Julia understood what Eric meant. Her face flushed, and she regretted agreeing to it. What should she do later? She walked to the kitchen door uneasily and looked out. She immediately saw Eric's figure walking upstairs. At the same time, she also saw Elizabeth. For some reason, Julia couldn't help but laugh when she saw Elizabeth. After washing the dishes, Julia and the nanny looked after Emma for a while. After dawdling for half an hour, they left the baby's room and headed upstairs to the bedroom. The morning sun shone into the bedroom through the curtains. Eric dreamed that he was submerged in a cold river. He opened his eyes while shivering, only to find that he was squeezed to the edge of the bed, and the blanket on his body had disappeared. Since he was already awake, Eric couldn't continue sleeping. He got dressed and left the bedroom. When he walked downstairs, he bumped into the slightly plump nanny who was about 30 years old. She was holding a milk bottle in her hand. Eric vaguely remembered that Julia called her Betty, so he greeted her. The Latina nanny named Betty was very clear about Eric's identity. She greeted him politely. Although she was curious about which mistress' room Eric spent the night in, she didn't show any unusual expression on her face. Eric followed Betty into the baby's room. The little guy was lying on the bed, looking around curiously with his pair of beautiful eyes. When he saw Eric, he opened his mouth and giggled a few times, waving his little hands around. Eric noticed the nanny's tired face and said, "Miss Betty, let me feed the little guy. You can rest for a while." "It's okay, Mr. Williams. Someone will come to change shifts with me at 8. Didn't you say the other one was sick?" Eric asked as he reached out his hand to Betty. Seeing that Eric insisted, Betty handed the milk bottle over and explained, "Ms. Robert hired another one. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to handle it." Seeing that Eric was feeding the little guy, Betty nonchalantly walked to the side and tidied up the diapers the little guy made last night. However, she couldn't help but look at Eric a few more times. Looking at how familiar Eric was, she couldn't help but wonder if this little guy was Julia's illegitimate daughter, and was just pretending to be Julia's daughter. Chapter 413. A Chevrolet stopped in the parking lot of Firefly's headquarters. Jim Carrey got out of the car from the front passenger seat and looked at his outfit through the window again. He also quickly made a few facial expressions to make himself look more energetic. When his agent, Carl Makerson, also got out, the two of them walked toward the office building not far away. After informing the receptionist of their names, the two of them walked into the elevator together. Standing side by side in the elevator, Jim Carrey clasped his hands in front of him and tiptoed. He looked at his agent and said, "That's unbelievable." Carl Makerson also looked expectant. "Yeah, that's Eric Williams. I thought it was a scam." When they reached the top floor, the elevator door opened. Jim Carrey and Carl Makerson saw a man in his 30s standing outside the elevator. "Hello, Mr. Carrey, Mr. Makerson. I'm Williams' assistant, Alan Fissman." Seeing the man reach out his hand, Jim Carrey quickly stepped forward. "Hello, I'm Jim Carrey." "Of course." Alan felt Jim Carrey's uneasiness and smiled. "I've seen your acting material, Mr. Carrey." After shaking hands with Carl Makerson, Alan said, "Please come with me. Mr. Williams is meeting a guest and will take a while. You can take a look at the contract first." Hearing the words of the contract, Jim Carrey and Carl Makerson looked excited. When they came to a meeting room, Alan handed the printed contract to the two of them and said, "You can take a look first. I still have some things to do. When Mr. Williams is done, I'll call you." After sending Alan off, Jim Carrey and Carl Makerson quickly opened the contract folder. After reading a few pages, Carl Makerson looked up with a worried expression and said, "Jim, this is the option contract." Jim Carrey just nodded slightly and continued to read the contract in his hand carefully. Noticing that Jim Carrey did not have much of a reaction, Carl Makerson continued reading. After Carl Makerson finished reading, he did not know what to say. The contract in his hand was neither harsh nor harsh. The harsh part was that this contract required Jim Carrey to only act for one film company for the next 5 years. This condition was very similar to the contracts of stars in the era of the big film studios decades ago. However, The difference was that the contract did not stipulate that Jim Carrey had to be like the big film studios. No matter how famous an actor was, he could only negotiate with the film company based on the box office data of his movies. If Jim Carrey wanted to breach the contract within 5 years, he would have to pay a penalty of $100 million. $100 million. Carl Makerson looked at the guy beside him. He had never thought that the actor he represented was worth $100 million. After Jim Carrey finished reading the contract, he looked up at his agent and asked, "Carl, didn't you say that I'm going to work with Firefly? Why does the contract say that I'm going to sign with TG Film?" Although Carl Makerson was just an inconspicuous agent at the bottom of the William Morris agency, he was much more well-informed than Jim Carrey. After cautiously glancing at the closed door of the reception room, Carl Makerson said in a low voice, "The founders of TG Film, Elizabeth Murdoch, Drew Barrymore and Julia Roberts are all inextricably linked to Eric Williams. There are even rumors that they are Williams' women." The recent Oscar-winning thriller, The Silence of the Lambs, was produced by these 3 women with the support of Williams. Therefore, signing with TG Film is no different from signing with Firefly. Jim Carrey envied Eric's luck with women and said, "Then what do you think of this contract?" Carl Makerson could tell that Jim Carrey was tempted. For an actor like Jim Carrey, who could barely be considered a C-list actor, to be able to work with the hottest star in Hollywood, Eric Williams, was simply a dream for many actors of the same level. "Jim, almost all of the clauses in this contract are personal restrictions for you. There's even a penalty of up to $100 million. Moreover, there's no clause about how many movies you'll be assigned to in 5 years. If you have a conflict with TG Film, they can even freeze you because of the huge penalty." Jim Carrey said, "How can I have a conflict with TG Film? The value of actors who act in Williams movies will skyrocket. If your salary increases to $5 million after acting in a movie, but TG Film is only willing to pay you $1 million, do you think you'll have a conflict with them?" Jim Carrey laughed and said, "Carl, I only received $50,000 once in a horror movie 6 years ago. Last year, I only received $2,000 per episode for acting in a TV series. Even if what you said is true, it doesn't seem to be a bad thing. If I miss this opportunity, I don't know if I'll have a chance to receive $1 million in my lifetime." Carl Makerson gently shook his head. He knew Jim Carrey's character very well, because he had experienced a long and difficult life at the bottom of society when he was young. Jim Carrey valued money very much. Now, although he looked like it was fine even if he suffered a little loss, once his net worth increased to $5 million, if he could only receive $1 million, it would be strange if Jim Carrey didn't fall out with the film company. However, Carl Makerson didn't say this out loud. No one liked to be called greedy. Once he reached a deal with Eric Williams, Jim Carrey's commission would likely become his main source of income. "Jim, you have to think this through. Although I really want to help you fight with Eric Williams, you should understand that with our status, we have no room to bargain with him. We don't even know what movie you're going to work on with Eric Williams." While the two of them were discussing in the reception room, Eric was in an office not far away, discussing Saving Private Ryan with Catherine Bigelow, who had rushed back from New York. During her research on World War II in New York, Catherine had developed a strong interest in this period of history. She even found the original character of Saving Private Ryan in a large pile of World War II historical materials. This surprised Eric a little because he didn't even know that there was an original character for this story. Eric planned to release Saving Private Ryan on the 50th anniversary of the Normandy landing in 1994. Catherine planned to use a year to do detailed research and field research. The preliminary preparations would begin the next year, and the official shooting would begin in the summer of 1993. This was similar to Catherine's work rhythm in Eric's memory, which was about a movie every 3 years. Moreover, for a war epic like Saving Private Ryan, 3 years of production time was not considered long. The complicated pre-production preparations were not something that could be completed in a few months. Recreating the Normandy landing scene, building the ruins at the end of the movie, and countless military props from World War II in the movie required a lot of time to prepare. Moreover, Catherine planned to do all the work herself. After discussing some specific production details, Catherine, who was holding a pen in her hand, raised her head from a pile of materials and said to Eric, "About the candidate for Captain Miller, I plan to, Tom Hanks. I've already contacted Tom, and he said that he will make time for this movie." Catherine paused and asked, "Tom Hanks, the nagging single father in Sleepless in Seattle?" "Yeah, I didn't expect you to have seen this movie too. What do you think?" "It feels like it was made by a woman," Catherine said bluntly. Then she realized that she was also a woman and said, well, the plot of this movie is very delicate. It's not a script that a young man like you can write." Eric's expression did not change, but he was amazed at a woman's keen intuition. The original version of Sleepless in Seattle was the work of the female director, Nora Ephron. However, Eric was still quite thick-skinned. He leaned on the desk closer to the woman opposite him and said, "I'm a genius. I can't be measured by common sense." Catherine leaned back slightly, rolled her eyes at Eric and said, "But you promised not to interfere with this movie. Also, Tom Hanks is a comedian. Tom's acting career is very broad. He just acts more in comedies. You can take the time to invite him for an audition. I guarantee that Tom's performance will surprise you. If you're not satisfied with Tom's performance after the audition, then you can still find the candidate you want," Eric said with a sly smile. "But I think with your professionalism, you won't deliberately reject Tom just because you're angry with me, right?" "Okay, I'll contact Mr. Hanks." Catherine stood up and put the materials in front of her into a satchel. She looked at Elizabeth, who had been sitting in the corner reading a magazine. Catherine had only said hello to Elizabeth when she came. Catherine keenly felt that Elizabeth was hostile to her, which made her feel a little funny. How could she steal this little B** starred from her? "You must have other things to do. I'll leave first." Eric also stood up. "I'll walk you out." After sending Catherine off, Eric returned to his office. Elizabeth had already taken over his office chair. She looked at him with her chin propped up. "I didn't expect you to like this kind of woman." Eric picked Elizabeth up and threw her aside. He sat down and said, "What kind of woman?" Elizabeth reached out and gestured above Eric's head. She teased, "As long as she wears high heels, she'll be taller than you." Eric had grown to 1.85 meters in the past 2 years, while Catherine was only 1.82 meters. Although she would be taller than Eric if she wore high heels, Eric did not care too much. He smiled and said, "As long as she doesn't wear high heels, she'll be shorter than me. Besides, women will always be shorter than men in certain situations." Elizabeth blushed and spat. Thinking of what happened last night, she had to change the topic. "Do you think Jim Carrey will accept that contract?" "As long as he's in his right mind, he'll definitely accept it." Elizabeth found the contract drafted by Eric and sat down in Catherine's original seat. She said, "But I feel that this contract is very strange. You made these terms to suppress his future salary. Why don't you just sign a contract with him for a few movies at a lower price? Wouldn't that save you a lot of trouble? He's just a nobody now, and he'll definitely accept it." "That will only make things worse. If his salary is increased to $1 million, and we only give him $100,000 in the contract, do you think he'll obediently make movies for you?" "Why not? Anyway, there's a contract. At most, we'll just have to go to court. Even if he compromises and makes movies for you at a lower price, you can't prevent him from slacking off and deliberately screwing up the movie. Moreover, once the contract ends, the two parties will become enemies, and there will be no possibility of cooperation anymore." Elizabeth waved the contract in her hand. "But I think this contract is very likely to screw up the relationship between the two parties, right? We'll pay him according to his net worth. The $100 million penalty is just to restrict him from deliberately asking for too much. I've asked someone to investigate this person. If there's no restriction, he'll definitely ask for too much. Moreover, after 5 years of cooperation, I think there's no need to cooperate anymore. At that time, his net worth will definitely be more than $10 million, and he might even participate in the movie's profits. If we cooperate again, It'll be the movie company working for him. Okay, you always make sense. Although why Elizabeth agreed with Eric's point of view, she was still not convinced on the surface. Eric just smiled and picked up the microphone on the table to inform Alan to let Jim Carrey and Carl Makerson in. A moment later, there was a knock on the office door. The two pushed the door open and walked in. They saw another woman in the office. Although they had heard of why Elizabeth, they had never seen her before. For a moment, they could not help but look at why Elizabeth curiously. Eric did not pretend to be polite. He stood up gently to greet the two and introduced why Elizabeth. The four of them sat down on the sofa in the corner of the office. So Mr. Carey and Mr. Makerson, right? Have you thought about it? The two looked at each other. Although they knew that there was not much hope, Carl Makerson still mustered up the courage to say, Mr. Williams, isn't this contract a bit too harsh? Harsh? What do you mean? Carl Makerson said, for example, the 5-year limit and the $100 million USD penalty. As long as you don't intend to breach the contract, it doesn't seem to be a big deal, right? Eric restrained his expression and looked at the two opposite him. The corner of his mouth turned into a half smile. Are you saying that the contract hasn't been signed yet, and you're already thinking about breaching the contract? Chapter 4:14. Although he did not see any displeasure on Eric's face, Jim Carrey hurriedly explained, No, Mr. Williams, that's not what Carl meant. I really hope to work with you. But this contract doesn't seem to have much to do with the movie. Due to the need to keep the project confidential, we can only discuss the movie after the contract is settled. Carl Makerson interrupted again. Mr. Williams, may I ask if King's role is the male lead? Eric nodded and said, Of course. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gone through so much trouble. Besides, I'm very optimistic about the movie project in my hands. I'm very sure that this movie can promote the male lead to the ranks of A-list stars. So this contract is not harsh. It's a very fair exchange of interests. Don't forget, there are 200,000 people waiting for this opportunity every day. More than 90% of them will never get it in their lifetime. My time is tight, so I'm sorry I can't give you too much time to consider. If you don't agree, I can only say that it's a pity. I'll immediately arrange for other candidates. Jim Carrey looked at his agent nervously. Carl Makerson originally wanted to ask Eric to give them a few days to consider, but after hearing Eric's words, he could only give Jim Carrey a look to let him decide. But from the bottom of his heart, Carl Makerson still hoped that Jim Carrey would agree. As Eric said, many actors in Hollywood might not get such an opportunity in their lifetime. Jim Carrey quickly made up his mind and asked, Mr. Williams, are we going to sign the contract now? Eric smiled faintly and said, Yes. Of course, you can also inform your lawyer to come over and review the contract again. If there are no problems, we can sign the contract in the morning. You'll see the script in a week. Jim Carrey exchanged a few more glances with his agent, and then nodded in agreement. Eric did not need to intervene in the following matters. After Alan left with the two men, Elizabeth asked, Eric, you just said that he'll see the script in a week. Where's the script? Eric took out an outline from the filing cabinet and handed it to Elizabeth. This is the outline of the story that I wrote. The scriptwriters are still working on the details. Elizabeth picked up a few thin pages and glanced at the title. Dumb and Melon. Just by looking at the name, I can tell it's a comedy. What a lousy name. Eric sat down in his office chair and ignored Elizabeth's habitual sarcasm. He picked up a document that was waiting to be processed and started to read it. After taking down Jim Carrey, Firefly's achievements in comedy over the next few years were absolutely unparalleled. Jim Carrey was one of the few comedy kings in the history of Hollywood. When it came to Hollywood's $20 million salary, many people would list the names of Hollywood superstars. However, the first person in the history of Hollywood to receive $20 million was not Schwarzenegger, not Stallone, nor was it Harrison Ford. It was Jim Carrey. Eric had seen many of Jim Carrey's movies. Of course, the one that left the deepest impression on him was The Disguised Genius. The Disguised Genius was also one of Jim Carrey's best works. The reason why he chose Dumb and Melon in front of him was mainly because of the copyright. The Disguised Genius was a comic work from Dark Horse Comics in 1980. Although Eric had investigated and found that the movie copyright of this comic was still in the hands of Dark Horse Comics, it would definitely cost a lot to acquire the copyright of this comic now. In addition to the conceivable competitors, Dark Horse Comics would definitely raise the price. However, Eric had already thought of a time to make a move. It would be after the release of Cutthroat Island, which was being co-produced by Disney and Robert Shea. Everyone in Hollywood knew that Robert Shea had snatched the script of Cutthroat Island from him. Once this movie failed at the box office like the original version, those who wanted to compete with Eric for the script would have to think carefully about whether it was another trap. As for the original authors of Dumb and Melon, the Ferrari brothers, there was still no sign of them in Hollywood. After Eric asked someone to register the story, he handed it over to Firefly's screenwriting department to perfect it. In addition to Dumb and Melon, Eric also found the screenwriter and director of Jim Carrey's other work, Detective Airplane, Tom Shadyac, and the other party had also registered a script similar to Detective Airplane with the Screenwriters Association. In the original Space-Time, Tom Shadyac and Jim Carrey had collaborated on many movies, but Tom Shadyac was still an inconspicuous screenwriter under Warner Pictures. Eric had already planned to poach him and put him in the Dumb and Melon crew to gain experience. After that, he could form a fixed partner with Jim Carrey. Elizabeth looked at the outline of Dumb and Melon in her hand. Although she didn't think there was anything special, out of trust for Eric, Elizabeth didn't express too much doubt. She just asked, "Eric, do you have a suitable director for this story?" "Well, have you seen The Adventures of Abby and Abby? I plan to let the director of this film, Stephen Herrick, direct this movie." "Oh right, these are your matters. I will get someone to give you the details as soon as possible. You just have to produce the finished film before the end of the year." Elizabeth said. "Then what about Flowers at the End of the Road? I had a hard time convincing Ridley Scott to direct this movie. Now you want me to prepare for Dumb and Melon. I'll definitely be too busy." "Don't you have Drew to help you? Besides, as a boss, if you have to do everything by yourself, you'll be exhausted. Don't you know how to hire a professional producer?" "Of course I can think of that, but forget it, I don't want to explain it to you." Eric looked at the girl's competitive expression and could also guess that Elizabeth wanted to train herself more. "If you don't want to explain, then don't stay here. I still have a lot of work to do. I have to go to Oklahoma tomorrow to view the scenery. I won't be back until a week later. There are a lot of things waiting for me to deal with today." Elizabeth seized on Eric's words and retorted, "As a boss, you still have to do everything by yourself. Be careful of premature aging. No matter how premature I am, I can still easily deal with you. If there's nothing else, go out and close the door. I won't see you out." Elizabeth snorted and stood up to leave. She immediately sat down and leaned on the other side of the desk. She asked with some anticipation, "Hey for the Oscars at the end of the month, who do you plan to bring? Who do you plan to bring to the red carpet?" Eric looked up and asked directly, "You want to come with me?" Elizabeth blushed and did not dare to look into Eric's eyes. She lowered her head and nodded like a mosquito. Eric shook his head and said, "I'm sorry, I plan to walk the red carpet alone." "Why?" "Because there are too many women. I can't bring anyone, so I might as well not bring anyone." Elizabeth stared at Eric and said, "You're really straightforward. Okay, be good, don't throw a tantrum. If you feel uncomfortable walking the red carpet alone, you can bring Julia. I'll be magnanimous and not pursue the matter of you guys having a lesbian relationship. Don't think I can't find a partner to walk the red carpet with." Eric narrowed his eyes and said, "You can try." Elizabeth snorted guiltily and ignored Eric. She got up and left his office. Jim Carrey signed the contract with Firefly that morning, but Eric did not take the time to meet him. The next day, he took the special effects team from Digital Domain and a few key members of the Tornado crew to Oklahoma. Oklahoma was located in the south-central part of the United States. It was at the beginning of the tornado corridor in the Central Plains of the United States. Every April, Oklahoma would experience frequent tornadoes. For an entire week, the crew traveled to many areas in northern Oklahoma. This was with the pre-production team doing a lot of work. Otherwise, it would have been impossible to complete all this work in a week. In addition to choosing a location, Eric also obtained a lot of real data on tornadoes from a meteorological institute in Oklahoma City. A week later, Eric brought most of the crew back to Los Angeles. However, he left behind a team of 5 people to communicate with Eric about the location he had chosen. At the same time, they were negotiating with the state of Oklahoma about the tax refund for the filming of Tornado. Although the tax refund for each state in the United States was not as high as it would be a decade later, compared to the production cost of Tornado, no matter how low the tax refund was, it was still a very objective figure. It was already March 9th when they returned to Los Angeles. As the headquarters of Hollywood, the atmosphere of the upcoming 63rd Oscars was getting stronger and stronger. The nominees for this year's Oscars had already been announced. In addition to the horror film, The Silence of the Lambs, which was nominated for Best Picture more than a decade later, Francis Coppola's The Godfather 3, Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas, and Penny Marshall's Asking the Heavens, were all popular movies during this award season. In addition, Ghost, which should have been nominated for Best Picture in the original space-time, did not get this nomination this time. There was no doubt that this was not because the quality of the movie was not up to standard. The main factor was Eric's age. Although the movie was good enough, the group of old-fashioned old men in the Film Academy might have subconsciously felt that Eric was so young and the movie had achieved enough success in the box office, so there was no need to rush to fight for such an important Oscar nomination. Eric was not in the mood to care about this kind of thing. Even if he was nominated for Best Picture, if he did not win, it would not be of much help to Ghost. The movie had already been cancelled, and was destined to be written in the annals of Hollywood romance movies. Other than Ghost, Firefly did not have any other works to show at the Oscars. Although Catherine's Shock Point received good reviews, it was destined to receive no nominations at the Oscars because of its biased views. The other 2 movies related to Firefly, Sleeping with the Enemy and Instinct, of course only won box office and did not do much in terms of awards. Although Firefly basically did not have anything to do at this year's Oscars, after returning to Los Angeles, Eric had to take the time to attend several public relations parties and personally lobby for The Silence of the Lambs. In the days leading up to the Oscars, while doing public relations for The Silence of the Lambs, Elizabeth and Drew also began preparing for Dumb and Melon. At the same time, they completely handed over Flowers at the End of the Line to Ridley Scott. Ridley Scott had been famous in Hollywood for a long time. Not to mention the works in his memory, Ridley Scott had already filmed classics such as Alien and Blade Runner. He was qualified enough to be the director and producer of Flowers at the End of the Line. Hollywood did not lack movies waiting to be produced. Even if they did not develop new works, Firefly and New Line had already accumulated a lot of films that could be made into sequels. Of course, the Home Alone series was destined to be a series that could not be ignored, but Eric was not very enthusiastic about making this series. The main reason was that in his memory, the box office of the third Home Alone, in his previous life, was only 1/10 of the second movie's box office, but the production cost was not much lower than the first 2 movies. Although there was no need to change the main character like in his previous life, the unpredictable risk was still difficult to ignore. Eric even planned to sell the rights to the sequels of this series, and perhaps make some exchanges with other film companies. In addition to Home Alone, Columbia once again proposed to make a sequel to Dark War. This time, Tom Cruise even had the idea of resurrecting in Dark War. After all, the American version of Dark War, produced by Eric, was a blockbuster film with a global box office of $500 million. On the other hand, after Cruise set up his own company, his ambitious first blockbuster film, Thunder Ambition, ended in failure. Although a box office of $80 million was not low, compared to the film's huge production cost of $80 million, Thunder Ambition could only be described as a failure. Under such circumstances, no film company dared to rashly cooperate with Tom Cruise in a big production. And Cruise did not want to go back and make a low-budget literary film. In the past 2 years, Hollywood had experienced a series of blockbusters, and the filmmakers had gradually formed the idea that if they wanted to make a lot of money, they had to invest a lot. Just like how Mission Impossible was started every time Cruise's popularity began to decline. This time, Cruise was very smart to choose Dark War. However, the first company that Cruise contacted was Columbia, which had just been acquired by the Japanese, and not Firefly. Chapter 4:15. The current CEO of Columbia was Peter Guber. After Sony acquired Columbia, they spent another $200 million to acquire Peter Guber's production company, and invited him to be the new head of Columbia. The new head of one of the 7 major movie studios had brought a copyright lawsuit with Warner Pictures. Eric did not know the details of the lawsuit, but Sony paid another $800 million in compensation to settle the lawsuit. Eric still remembered that because of Peter Guber's extravagant spending, Sony Columbia had a loss of $7 billion in just a few years. It was rumored that Sony's founder and CEO, Morita Akio, was forced to step down because of this acquisition. However, although Peter Guber was mediocre, he was very good at currying favor with Sony's top management to stabilize his position. He knew that after Sony acquired Columbia, what they wanted the most was for Columbia to help Sony become famous. So after getting control of Columbia, Peter Guber could not wait to start a few big film projects. Last summer, Schwarzenegger starred in Total Recall, and Spielberg's Captain Hawk were both produced under Peter Guber's influence. Big productions, big directors, and big stars were Peter Guber's main strategy for making movies. As long as the movie could bring enough influence, the new head of Columbia did not care about whether the investment was rational, and whether the movie could recover its cost. When Tom Cruise contacted Columbia, hoping to restart the Dark War project, Columbia was very enthusiastic. After all, although Cruise's last movie, Thunder Rising, was not a success, it did not affect Cruise's position in Hollywood. For Hollywood A-listers, they usually have 3 chances to fail. If they fail 3 times in a row, their position will be affected. When Eric learned about this, Columbia had already discussed a preliminary script with Tom Cruise. The person who came to discuss the sequel of Dark War with Eric was still Amy Pascal. When Amy walked into Eric's office, Eric was already looking at the project documents sent by Columbia. Because this project was led by Tom Cruise, and Eric was not interested in the sequel of Dark War. And Hank said that without Eric he would not participate in the sequel of Dark War. Columbia decided to get rid of Hanks and Eric and develop a prequel of Dark War, with Tom Cruise as the main character. The new script set the movie in London, England, where Andy's father, Peter, died. At the beginning of the story, Andy did not know that he was sick, and he was a bad guy who took over his father's business. A kind girl was involved in a smuggling business that Andy was involved in. Like many stories, Andy was gradually moved by the girl's kindness, and he accidentally found out that he was terminally ill. Finally, he made the right choice. The story was also interspersed with some foreshadowing that Andy's father, Peter, was plotted against by his student and died of depression. At the end of the story, the good guys were rewarded, and the bad guys were punished. Andy told the girl a beautiful lie, saying that he was going to Los Angeles to settle some things, and left alone when the girl was reluctant to part with him. In Eric's opinion, this story was very good, but strictly speaking, except for Andy, the new story had nothing to do with Dark War. There was not much that reflected the name of Dark War. It was completely a one-man show. Even if this sequel was successful, the brand of Dark War would completely change, because the fame accumulated from the first story would be greatly damaged, and the series would basically be scrapped. Eric felt that even if a sequel was to be made, it would be best to have Tom Hanks as the main character. Just like Batman, where a classic villain appeared in every movie, this was the best way to perfectly continue the series. After Amy Pascal entered Eric's office, she simply greeted Eric, and sat quietly on the sofa in the reception area, patiently waiting for Eric to read the document in his hand. After Amy Pascal finished a cup of coffee, Eric also roughly browsed through the document in his hand. "Eric, what do you think?" Amy waited for Eric to sit down across from her, and asked impatiently. If Eric agreed, she would be able to take the lead of this project. Operating such a large project would help her accumulate a lot of experience. Eric did not answer this question but asked, "Did Sony Pictures sign a cooperation agreement with Cruise?" Amy Pascal did not expect Eric to suddenly ask this question. She was not mentally prepared, and it was inevitable for her to reveal some flaws. Eric did not pursue the matter. He only expressed his dissatisfaction with Columbia for negotiating with Cruise. After all, Firefly owned half of the copyright of Dark War. If Columbia did this, it could be said that Columbia had violated Firefly's rights. If Eric pursued this matter seriously, any contract between Sony and Cruise regarding Dark War will be void. But he does not intend to do this. Amy, according to your proposal, this series has completely deviated from the theme of Dark War. It has become an ordinary action movie. Although the popularity of the first movie and Cruise's box office appeal make this movie a success, because of the deviation, it will not be easy to make a sequel. Amy Pascal saw that Eric did not pursue the matter, so she was relieved and said, "Eric, in fact, Columbia still hopes that you and Mr. Hanks can join this movie." Eric shook his head slightly and smiled. "I have a rough understanding of Captain Hawk. Sony is not only in charge of all the investments for this movie, but they also promise Spielberg, Dustin Hoffman, and Robin Williams a 40% share of the profits. Firefly owns half of the copyright of Dark War. In this case, how much do you think Hanks, Cruise, and I should get?" Amy said calmly. "As long as you can join this movie, any conditions are negotiable." "But that will definitely not meet my expectations." Eric smiled. "Also, my work plans for the next few years have all been determined. Plus, I still need to take care of Firefly's business, so I don't have time to take care of a big production movie." Amy only showed a slight look of regret, but she was not too disappointed in her heart. In fact, at the internal meeting of Columbia, she raised this issue to the management. With Firefly's current status in Hollywood, Eric, as the absolute owner of Firefly, was already too busy with his own company's affairs. It was unlikely that he would direct a movie for another movie company, and the possibility of cooperation was very low. "Eric, in fact, you can be like Mr. Spielberg. You can just be a producer in name. You don't need to do anything, and you can get a lot of money. Do you think this is okay?" Spielberg was a producer in 4 or 5 movies a year on average, which also made him one of the producers with the highest cumulative box office in Hollywood. However, most of the time, he was only a producer in name, and did not participate in the movie from beginning to end. Spielberg even laughed at himself for this. But Eric did not intend to do this. Although Spielberg's status in Hollywood was very high, because of this method of being a producer in name, it also attracted a lot of negative influence. A lot of things obviously had nothing to do with him, but because Spielberg was the most famous, once something happened to the movie, it would be no surprise that he would be the scapegoat. After thinking for a moment, Eric did not say his idea of Hanks as the main creator of the series. For celebrities like Cruise or Hanks, once any movie had more than 3 sequels, most of the profits would fall into the hands of these big names, and the movie company would be working for them. Even if Eric had a good relationship with Hanks, it was impossible for him to suppress Hanks' salary. Therefore, many Hollywood movies often only lasted until 3 sequels. When they were restarted, in order to reduce costs as much as possible, most of them would change the lead actor, or keep the lead actor, and replace all the supporting actors. "How about this, Amy? Firefly will not participate in this production, but I have 2 cooperation plans. One is a single license for $30 million. The other is that Firefly will sell half of the copyright of Dark War to Columbia for $100 million. After Eric finished speaking, he picked up the coffee in front of him and slowly drank it, giving Amy Pascal some time to think. Although the temptation of a buyout was great, the risk was also great. So far, there were only a few movie series in Hollywood that could produce more than 3 sequels. Even if there were, they were basically low-budget horror movies that could be produced once a year. Even if there were more than 3 sequels, the time span was often more than 10 years. In comparison, it was more cost-effective to buy a single license for $30 million. Amy didn't think for long. If she had the right to decide, she would not hesitate to choose the former plan proposed by Eric at this time. This way, she could avoid risks to the maximum extent. Moreover, compared to the box office results of the last Dark War, the price of $30 million was very cost-effective. Unfortunately, although she was already in the position of Columbia's vice president, Amy had no decision-making power when it came to tens of millions of dollars of investment. And Amy Pascal vaguely felt that Eric seemed to have considered this. She even quickly thought that Eric throwing out this plan was actually equivalent to giving Columbia a bait. With Peter Guber's character, Amy was certain that Peter Guber would choose the latter buyout plan. Eric, most people are very optimistic about this sequel project. With the results of the first Dark War, even if the cost of the sequel exceeds $50 million and the box office results shrink by 30%, it can still bring a considerable profit. Why choose this plan? I don't have the energy to take care of this project anymore, Eric said. And Firefly just happens to be a little short of funds now, so I plan to cash out the copyright of Dark War. Although Eric got nearly $8 billion from the futures market, in order to achieve the unexpected effect of acquiring Disney, Eric did not intend to use too much of this money unless it was necessary. Therefore, Firefly's operation and expansion still relied on its own profits. Although Toy Story had not yet been released, because of his strong confidence in 3D animation, Eric had already asked Pixar to prepare for the next animated film, which all costs money. In addition to the recent integration and expansion of the company, the construction of the company's photography base, the funds that drove away Robert Shea, the announcement of Toy Story and Terminator 2, and the upcoming filming of Tornado, Firefly's original funds were quickly consumed. Amy Pascal remembered Firefly's recent series of big moves and realized that Firefly's funds might be tight. In this case, she might be able to lower the price slightly. But she immediately dismissed this idea. Although Eric was young, he had become a well-known hardliner in Hollywood. His biggest characteristic was that he did not like to engage in protracted negotiations with others. Once Eric had the upper hand, he would not even negotiate at all. From a lot of information, it could be seen that Firefly did not lack film projects. Eric even had an attitude of not having the copyright of a popular film like Dark War. This also meant that Eric was unlikely to compromise on the price. But Sony Columbia was different. Peter Guber was now in urgent need of a big production project to expand the influence of Sony Pictures and consolidate his position. If he knew about Eric's conditions, he would be very eager to get the copyright. Then there would be no room for negotiation on the price. What's more, it was the Japanese who paid for it. Even if he had to spend a little more, Peter Guber would not feel the pinch. Eric, I don't have the authority to make this decision. I need to go back and ask Mr. Guber. No problem. I will wait for your good news. Eric stood up and walked Amy Pascal out of the office. Sony Columbia did not consider for long. Just like what Eric thought, they decided to use the second option to negotiate with Firefly. Before the Oscars, the negotiations between Firefly and Columbia for the copyright of Dark War had stolen the limelight of the Oscars. Chapter 416. The car slowly drove into the parking lot of the Pointy Corner Manor. The driver turned his head and saw that Eric was resting with his eyes closed. He turned off the engine and sat quietly in the driver's seat, not disturbing Eric. However, Eric, who felt that the surroundings were completely quiet, quickly opened his eyes. He looked out of the car window and said, "I'm really sorry, Carl. Did I sleep for a long time?" The driver turned his head and said, "Not long, Mr. Williams. We just got home 2 minutes ago. However, I suggest that you rest more. You've been too tired recently." Eric walked out of the car and took a deep breath. The cool air of the Malibu coast entered his lungs, and he felt much more energetic. The driver named Carl followed him out and said, "Mr. Williams, the guard just said that Miss Kidman came over at night." "I got it. You go and rest." After Eric finished speaking, he took out his windbreaker and briefcase from the car and walked to the villa. In the villa's living room, the lights on the wall were slightly on. Eric walked to the corner of the living room and saw Nicole lying on the two-seater sofa, sleeping soundly with a pillow on her head. The girl was wearing a thin, light pink knitted sweater that rose and fell slightly with her breathing. Eric took a few glances. Although he was a little tempted, he did not disturb Nicole. It was already past 10 o'clock at night. Nicole must have been waiting for him for a long time. He took a thin blanket from the side and covered the girl. Eric walked to the bar in the corner and poured himself a glass of wine. He sat at the small coffee table on the other side and took out a stack of documents from the briefcase he brought back to continue reading. Eric had to go to Oklahoma to shoot Tornado after the Oscars, and this shooting cycle would take up to 3 months. If everything went well, the movie would not be wrapped up until the end of June. Therefore, Eric had to take advantage of his time in Los Angeles to deal with various affairs of Firefly. If he was content with the status quo, Eric could definitely delegate more power. After all, with his current wealth, even if he did not do anything, it was enough for him to live a comfortable life for the rest of his life. However, this body was only 20 years old, and it was the time when it was full of energy. Eric did not want to continue living like a drunkard. As a passerby in this dimension, Eric now had the mentality of a player. He wanted to see how many levels he could reach as a player before curtain call, and whether he could dominate the entire plane of dungeons. It was actually a very interesting thing. Time ticked by, and the only sound that could be heard in this area was the sound of pages being flipped. Perhaps she had slept enough, or perhaps she felt the chill of the night, but Nicole, who had been lying on the sofa, moved and opened her eyes. She pulled the thin blanket beside her and stared blankly for a moment. When she heard a sound not far away, she propped herself up and looked in that direction. Lying on the back of the sofa, she looked at Eric, who was sitting on the single-seater with his legs crossed, and focused on flipping through the documents in his hand. After a while the woman asked, "Eric, what time is it now?" "It's almost 12. Eric turned his head and looked at Nicole. Because she had just woken up, the woman's cheeks had a touch of charming blush, and a few strands of messy hair scattered in front of her forehead. It was a different kind of charm. No wonder many literary works always described the seductive appearance of women when they had just woken up. At this moment, Nicole indeed looked very charming. Feeling Eric's gaze on her face, Nicole smiled and reached out to stroke a strand of hair that had fallen on her cheek. She sat up and put on her high heels and walked to Eric's side. Eric moved to the side, and the woman did not stand on ceremony. She squeezed directly with Eric on the same single-seater sofa. Both of them were relatively thin, so it was not crowded on the same sofa. Nicole smiled and twisted her waist, but did not stop them. She leaned sideways in front of Eric and looked at the document in his hand. "What's this?" Eric said, "The script for the second 3D animation handed over by Pixar." With that said, Eric picked up another folder and handed it to Nicole. "This is the first draft of their character designs. Take a look. What do you think?" Nicole flipped open the blue folder and saw that there were many drawings of insects on the paper. After looking through it quickly, the woman said, "It's very cute. I don't know about the rest." "It's fine as long as you think it's cute. When I first gave the idea for this story to John and the others, they said that insects in reality were not very likable." Nicole gently hugged Eric's arm and smiled. "I think as long as it's a story that you come up with, it'll definitely be very good. You have so much confidence in me. Who knows, it won't be long before someone gets into big trouble because of this blindness. Then it'll definitely be because they didn't do a good job." Eric dragged his voice and suddenly asked teasingly, "You're so sweet today. This style of yours is quite different from before. Do you have something you need my help with again?" Nicole did not feel guilty at all. She said with a smile, "My mouth is very sweet. Do you want to try it?" With that said, the woman moved her face closer to Luke. Eric smiled and gently pecked Nicole's lips. He pretended to judge and said, "It's indeed a little sweet. It's really nothing. Hurry up and say it while I'm in a good mood." "I'm really fine, but someone wants me to help pull some strings. I don't think you'll agree, so if you don't ask, I'm not going to say anything." Eric's mind raced. Nicole was currently filming Captain Hawk. If it was Spielberg, he definitely wouldn't have asked Nicole to bring him flowers. The two of them had a good relationship, so Spielberg would definitely call him himself. Then other than Spielberg, it could only be someone else. Don't forget, Nicole's current agent was Parker Kingsley, And Parker Kingsley was also Tom Cruise's agent. It can't be Cruise, right? Eric asked tentatively. Nicole looked slightly surprised and nodded. Yes, but I didn't see him. It was Miss Paula Wagner who invited me to dinner yesterday and told me about it. Eric knew that the woman wanted to say that she did not have any private contact with Cruise. He smiled and asked, "It has something to do with the copyright of Dark War, right? Or is Cruise trying to get the other half of the copyright of Dark War?" This time, Nicole was even more surprised. "How do you know?" "It's easy to guess. Other than this, I can't think of anything else," Eric said. In fact, there was a precedent for this speculation. In his memory, Cruise owned half of the copyright of the Mission Impossible movie series. It was because of this that he could bargain with Paramount. In the end, for every Mission Impossible movie, Cruise would get more than Paramount. If Cruise did not own half of the copyright of Mission Impossible, Paramount would have kicked him out long ago. In his previous life, although Cruise and Paramount had a falling out, because of the copyright issue, Paramount had to bite the bullet and reconcile with Cruise in order to restart the Mission Impossible series. Now that the copyright of Mission Impossible had been bought by Drew in advance under Eric's instructions, after Cruise went solo, it was reasonable that he wanted to create his own series of movies. Dark War, which had a very good foundation, was a very good idea. Hearing Eric's words, Nicole said, "That's strange. If it were me, I wouldn't be able to guess. You must have heard something." Eric didn't dwell on this issue. Instead, he said, "Let's talk about it. I'm very interested in how Cruise wants to get half of the copyright of Dark War. Although he's now worth hundreds of millions of US dollars, I don't think he can squeeze out $100 million US dollars in cash. Cruise's production company should have found investors. Paula said yesterday that if you agree, we can talk in detail in person. They plan to pay part of the cash and make some exchange of interests, such as Cruise helping Firefly make a few movies and so on. If history didn't change, Cruise's salary, or the salary of the entire Hollywood star, wouldn't explode until 1995. At that time, the 20 million salary club was established, and A-list stars gradually became popular with the base salary plus a share of the salary model. In comparison, the 15 million salary of Schwarzenegger, Stallone, and others was not exaggerated at all. Eric would occasionally think about whether he could stop the crazy salary increase trend, because the Hong Kong stars on the other side of the ocean had already suffered the bitter fruit of crazy salary increases. In the past 2 years, the film market over there had spent most of the production costs on hiring stars because of the sky-high salary of stars, resulting in a large number of bad movies. In addition, the Southeast Asian countries had started to make Hong Kong movies, and Hong Kong movies were now on the verge of collapse. If there were no restrictions, the unlimited growth of the Hollywood star's salary was likely to lead to the same result. When the international market was expanding, perhaps the producers could still grit their teeth and pay such a high salary. Once the market was fixed, or even began to shrink, Hollywood movies would undoubtedly go the old road of Hong Kong movies. Before Eric's rebirth, the North American film market had been in a state of stagnation, and the European film market had been developed. Only the Asian film market was still expanding, but once the Asian film market reached saturation, the development of Hollywood would also reach a bottleneck. Seeing that Eric suddenly stopped talking, Nicole waited quietly for a while before she couldn't help but ask, "What are you thinking about? Why are you suddenly so lost in thought?" "No matter how much I want to exploit you small actors, the life of a capitalist is not easy." Nicole thought Eric was joking, so she laughed a few times and said, "Then should I tell Paula tomorrow that you don't agree with this?" "Well, if they directly take out cash, I can consider it. Forget about the collaboration. You should have noticed that there are very few big stars in Cruise's movies, because everyone doesn't like to work with Cruise. Cruise himself doesn't seem to be willing to work with big stars either. This time he plans to do Dark War alone." "Then I'll tell him that," Nicole said. She lowered her eyes slightly, stretched out a finger, and gently rubbed Eric's arm for a while before saying, "Eric, I heard that you don't have a female companion at the Oscars this time?" "I plan to go alone." Eric had no choice but to repeat what he had already said to the other women. "I'm sorry, Nicole. They've all asked around about this. But it seems that you didn't participate in a nominated film last year, right? Nicole replied regretfully. Oh, Pat helped me arrange a guest for the Best Cinematography Award, so I'll be there this time. Eric didn't want to continue this topic, so he quickly asked, how's the filming of Captain Hawk going? It's okay, Nicole said disappointedly, but she quickly realized that her tone was likely to make Eric misunderstand that she was throwing a tantrum because of the red carpet incident. She explained, I feel that Mr. Spielberg seems to be very anxious. These days, he even often announces that he will stop filming for no reason. Maybe. Nicole wanted to say that maybe it was a mistake for her to fight for this role, but after thinking about it, she didn't say it. She cried and begged for this role from Eric, so now she couldn't express her disdain. She could only silently swallow this bitter fruit. Judging from the current situation, Captain Hawk didn't seem to be of much help to her acting career. Thinking that half of Eric's Dark War copyright could be sold for $100 million, Nicole had a sudden idea. Eric, what do you think about me studying film production? Why do you suddenly want to do this? Eric asked. Nicole blushed. She couldn't say that it was more profitable, right? Although she did think that way, deep down, Nicole was envious of Julia, Drew, and Elizabeth's intention to set up TG Film Company. After The Silence of the Lambs was released through various channels, it could bring in more than $100 million in profit for the three women. Even if her current salary was maintained at $5 million, she would have to shoot 20 movies to make that much money. Also, although being an A-list actress was glamorous, in Hollywood, the real power was still in the hands of the film producers. If she didn't have any connections, Nicole would have had no choice but to be an actress. However, with Eric as her backer and the success of Elizabeth and the others, she was tempted to do so. I just suddenly wanted to try. If they can do it, I should be able to do it too. Eric thought for a moment and suddenly revealed a smirk. It's not impossible. If you can completely pull those two to your side, I'll support you in setting up a film company. Chapter 417. After impulsively expressing the idea of establishing a production company, Nicole felt that she was being too whimsical. In her opinion, TG Film's situation was very special. Although Elizabeth, who held the largest share of shares, was undoubtedly Eric's woman, she was also the second daughter of the Murdoch family, which allowed her to gain the support of 20th Century Fox. As for Drew, during their time together, Nicole deeply felt that Drew worshipped and relied on Eric. That little girl almost treated Eric as her god. It could be said that in TG, Drew was equivalent to Eric's substitute. If Eric wanted to intervene in TG, Drew would definitely be the most resolute executor. And Julia was the first female lead in a movie directed by Eric. All signs pointed to the fact that these three women were closer to Eric than she was. Thinking about herself, Nicole felt that she didn't seem to have anything worth Eric's investment. If she didn't do anything, she would definitely be marginalized in the future. Just as she was feeling a little disappointed, she suddenly heard Eric say, "It's not impossible. If you can completely pull two people to your side, I'll support you in establishing a film company." Nicole was surprised and puzzled at the same time. She asked, "Two people? Which two people?" "Parker Kingsley and Paula Wagner, Cruz's agent and partner," Eric replied with an enigmatic smile. Last year, Eric had such an idea. Parker Kingsley and Paula Wagner were undoubtedly two very capable women in their respective fields. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were the benefactors of Cruz's acting career. However, Eric remembered that these two women left Cruz one after another in the future. At the same time, Cruz's career began to slowly decline. That's not possible. Nicole's tone had no confidence at all. Although she was now a first-tier actress in Hollywood, in terms of status in Hollywood, she was still far from Cruz's. She knew very well that even if it was Paula Wagner who had nothing to do with her, Paula Wagner, even if it was Paula Jinsley, if she had to choose between her and Cruz, Paula Jinsley would abandon her without hesitation. Eric seemed to be more interested. He put the documents in his hand on the coffee table and said, "I think it's very easy. You just need to make Cruz feel that Paula Wagner and Paula Jinsley are more partial to you and ignore him. If during this period, Cruz's career declines a little, and your acting career makes a big leap forward, then it's even more logical. In the original space-time, Cruz and Paula Wagner fell out because Nicole's career was more successful than his, and she even won an Oscar. In the following few years, because Cruz's career went downhill, he parted ways with Paula Wagner and finally became a loner. Nicole's eyes flashed with excitement, not because of Eric's words about Cruz, but because of "and your acting career makes a big leap forward." This meant that Eric would definitely help her. If this little bastard could put more effort into her, Nicole would rather give up the idea of a production company. She leaned on Eric and complained a little. "You always ignore me. It's not that easy for me to go up a level in my career alone. You're playing tricks with me again." Eric smiled. Nicole also laughed a few times and reached out to hug Eric's neck. "You always say that I'm your woman. In that case, this is what you should do." Eric hugged Nicole's waist and looked up as if he was thinking. "It seems to make sense." "Yeah," Nicole agreed. Seeing Eric get up and walk to the other side, she asked, "Where are we going?" Eric stopped and looked at Nicole. "Terrace swimming pool. Do you want to come?" Nicole looked at Eric's thin clothes and said, "It's very cold outside. Do you want to catch a cold?" Eric did not care. He said, "Just put some hot water in the small pool next door. We can take a hot bath and watch the stars." How romantic. Nicole was also a little tempted. She stood up and thought for a while. "We should get a bathrobe or something. We have to come back later." Eric pointed outside and said, "No, there's one in the changing room outside." Eric was no longer on the same level as Cruz. Even if he didn't like Cruz, he wasn't in the mood to pick on him. Urging Nicole to steal Cruz's woman was just a small episode of his bad taste. It wouldn't be difficult to poach Paula Wagner and Paula Jinsley away from Cruz. Just like in his previous life, Eric planned to raise Nicole up and create a situation where both Paula and Paula were biased towards Nicole and ignored Cruz. This way, there would be a rift between Cruz and the two women. Over the next few days, Eric quickly picked out a good script from his memory. It was called Cop Hottie, starring Sandra Bullock in his previous life. The story was about the FBI agent Sarah and the Boston policewoman Shannon, who were worlds apart in terms of personality and figure. Coincidentally, they were paired up to investigate a case. The most memorable scene for Eric was that after a series of twists and turns, the two of them raised their glasses to celebrate their final victory. In the end, there was a muffled bang, and Sarah broke the beer glass. The glass shards cut a wound on Sarah's hand. Shannon, who had always been fierce, fainted at the sight of blood. She rolled her eyes and fell to the ground. The whole story was full of hilarious jokes, and Eric didn't even have to worry too much about it. He had already found two candidates for the lead roles. Nicole would play the FBI agent who was not popular and liked to nitpick, and Rosie O'Donnell, the actress who played Becky with Nicole in Sleepless in Seattle, could play the role of Shannon, which was very suitable for the role. Eric planned to let Nicole invite Paula Wagner to be the producer. If Paula could get Nicole nominated for a Golden Globe Award for Best Actress in a Musical or Comedy next year, the effect would be even better. Then during the summer he would arrange for Nicole to star in a blockbuster movie with good box office potential. As long as the two movies were successful, and the prequel Dark War, which Cruz participated in, did not become a blockbuster, it would be easy to achieve his goal. It was not difficult to achieve this goal. According to the details revealed by Dark War, this prequel would be a big production with a total investment of close to $100 million. If it did not get more than $300 million at the global box office, it would not be considered a success. In the original space-time, Tough Cop used $40 million to get $200 million at the global box office. Eric did not expect this female-oriented R-rated comedy to be as successful as it was in his previous life. Because it was released 10 years earlier, the budget for this version was only $20 million. Therefore, even if it did half of what it did in his previous life, it would be enough for Firefly to make a lot of money. The English name of hot cop flower was The Heat, which was a parody of the famous Stealing Fire, in primeval air. Now that the classic Thief of Fire had not been filmed yet, in order to create a gimmick, Eric imitated the naming method of Flowers at the End of the Road, and changed the name of the movie to Sarah and Shannon, because Flowers at the End of the Road would also be released at the end of the year, and the English name of Flowers at the End of the Road was Thelma and Louise. The two slightly feminist movies were released at the same time, and the themes were not the same, so they could play a good role in promoting each other. Before the Oscars, Columbia, which was rich and did not feel bad spending other people's money, reached a copyright transfer agreement with Firefly for Dark War. Half of the movie rights were sold for $100 million, which made many film companies envious. However, after the money was received, it was transferred to Pixar for the production of Bugs Crisis. Another sum of money was transferred to the construction of the studio base in Praia Vista, and the remaining funds were allocated to the budget of Tornado. The $100 million was spent before it was even warmed up. Eric could not help but sigh at the rapid expansion of film companies spending money like water. If it were not for the fact that they had enough chips in their hands and were unwilling to go public, Firefly would undoubtedly embark on the road of debt like other film companies. Many of the second- and third-tier film companies that had the potential to develop into giants in Hollywood often fell on the road of development because of the vicious cycle of huge debts. After a few months of publicity, on March 25, 1991, the 63rd Academy Awards ceremony was held at the Sacred Civic Auditorium in Los Angeles as scheduled. For Eric, this year's Oscars was completely a passerby. The nominations for Ghost had nothing to do with him. As for the guest presenter, the Oscar committee was very happy to let Eric go on stage to present the award. However, it was difficult for Eric to present the award. In Hollywood, stars of Eric's age could often only appear on stage by presenting technical awards, and that was under the condition that they had enough connections and fame. For example, Nicole's award for Best Cinematography this year was won by Pi Jinsley. However, with Eric's current status, if he was asked to present those insignificant technical awards, Eric would not agree at all. However, if he was asked to present important awards such as Best Director and Best Picture, Eric's qualifications were not enough. In the end, he could only leave it as it was. The limousine slowly stopped at the end of the red carpet. Eric calmly got out of the car. The waiting reporters raised their cameras and looked forward to the appearance of Eric's female companion. No matter who Eric walked the red carpet with, as long as they took a photo, whether it was real or fake, it could be hyped up. Chapter 418. However, they were destined to be disappointed. After Eric got out of the car, the limousine drove away and Eric stepped on the red carpet alone. When he passed through the interview area, Eric followed the reporter's request and stopped for a short photo shoot. Seeing that Eric was about to leave, a reporter in the crowd finally couldn't help but shout, "Mr. Williams, why didn't you bring a female companion?" Eric stopped and looked at the reporter who spoke. He seemed to want to say something, which made all the reporters perk up. As the media in the Hollywood circle, these people vaguely guessed that Eric might not know which woman to bring, so he simply didn't bring any. If Eric really said something similar, even if he asked, "Who do you think I should bring?" or something like that, it would definitely be a big piece of news with a lot of room for discussion. Eric kept everyone in suspense. He coughed lightly, glanced at the tape recorders raised by many reporters, and a smirk flashed across his face. He then turned and walked directly to the end of the red carpet. The group of reporters stared at Eric's back for a while before a few self-deprecating laughs came from the crowd. Eric's appearance order was relatively late. As usual, a large number of people were already waiting at the end of the red carpet. Occasionally, a few celebrities would pretend to inadvertently pass through the live broadcast of ABC TV, hoping to show their faces on the red carpet live broadcast. Seeing Eric's arrival, the familiar people greeted him warmly. Eric greeted Coppola and Al from the Godfather 3 crew one by one. Because Cage was Coppola's nephew, the Ghost crew members were also near the Godfather 3 crew. The Silence of the Lambs crew also gathered because of Eric. Soon a small circle of more than 10 people was formed. "What's going on over there?" After Eric greeted everyone, he raised his chin toward a large group of people on the left. There was also a group of people gathered there. But before anyone could answer, the group seemed to have received some kind of signal and gradually dispersed. Eric finally saw a man and a woman surrounded by the crowd. The others looked strange and did not speak. Francis Coppola said, "That's Rennie Harlin and Gina Davis. You must know Eric, right?" Eric said calmly, "Of course I know them." At the same time, he also understood why so many people had gathered around Rennie Harlin and Gina Davis, and why they dispersed quietly after he appeared. Not only did Rennie Harlin get the directing rights for Cutthroat Island, but before that he was also the director of Fox's Die Hard 2. The story of the script of Cutthroat Island had spread all over Hollywood. Except for a few people who knew that it was a trap, most people were optimistic about the prospects of the movie. Once Rennie Harlin had 2 blockbuster movies in a row, his status in Hollywood would be very hot. No wonder so many people just went up to him to talk to him. At this time, Rennie Harlin and Gina Davis also saw him. Rennie Harlin just nodded at him from afar and pulled Gina Davis to the other side. "Ray, we should go up and say hello," Gina Davis, who was holding Rennie Harlin's arm, whispered. Rennie Harlin shot his first movie at the age of 26. Now in his early 30s, he had gotten the directing rights for 2 big movies in a row. Although he could not compare with Eric, he was enough to look down on most of the mediocre directors in Hollywood. Therefore, when Eric just appeared, the scene of the stars around them walking away because of scruples made Rennie Harlin feel very uncomfortable. Hearing his wife's words, Rennie Harlin was even more unhappy. He said, "Disney and Robert Shea have offended Williams because of the script of Cutthroat Island. If we go up and say hello, not only will we not win his favor, but if Michael Eisner and Robert Shea see us, they will have a problem with us. There is no need to do this kind of thing that will not please both sides." Gina Davis sighed and didn't say anything else. And in Eric's circle, it was inevitable that the matter of Cutthroat Island would be talked about. Francis Coppola watched Rennie Harlin and Gina Davis disappear, and said to Elizabeth, "The script of Cutthroat Island was snatched away. This is an accident. I just don't understand why Fox let Rennie Harlin go so easily. Is there any secret behind this?" Elizabeth glanced at Eric. Rennie Harlin was originally a young director trained by Fox Film Company. For this reason, the sequel of Die Hard, was given to him to direct. Moreover, Fox had already investigated that Eric had appointed Rennie Harlin as the director of Cutthroat Island. If Eric had not said, "Don't snatch the script," Fox would not have let Rennie Harlin go so easily even if the lawsuit had dragged on for a few years. Of course, this matter was not to be told to outsiders. In the face of Coppola's question, Elizabeth could only shake her head as if nothing had happened. "I don't know about this. Fox's business is not something I can interfere with." Coppola saw that Elizabeth was not telling the truth, but he did not think that Cutthroat Island was a trap. He thought that this time Fox, like Eric, had fallen into Disney's trap. Thinking of this, Coppola patted Eric on the shoulder like an elder. "Eric, Hollywood is actually like this, so don't take it too seriously. It's just a script. The last thing you lack is a script, haha." Eric also laughed and asked, "Frank, how many Oscars do you plan to get for The Godfather 3 this time?" Coppola looked indifferent and said with a smile, "As long as I don't go home empty-handed, I'll be satisfied. You know, facing the little princess of Fox, I'm also under a lot of pressure." "Mr. Coppola, you are also making fun of me," Elizabeth complained, but she glared at Eric. If it weren't for this guy, she wouldn't have gotten such a derogatory nickname. Everyone laughed again. Soon, the guests attending the ceremony began to walk into the auditorium one after another. When Eric found his seat, he was dumbfounded when he saw Elizabeth and Nicole sitting on his left and right. He just said hello to Nicole outside, and agreed to see her at the party after the ceremony. He did not expect this to happen. This was definitely intentional by the Oscar organizing committee. This is so bad. Although he was complaining in his heart, it was not appropriate to change his seat at this time. The ceremony had not yet started, and Eric was thinking about how to adjust the atmosphere. However, the 2 women acted like they were familiar with each other. Elizabeth even reached out to Nicole. Hello, Miss Kidman, long time no see. Long time no see, Miss Murdoch. Nicole also stretched out her slender arm and took Elizabeth's small hand. When the people around saw this scene, they consciously shifted their gazes away. Eric could feel sparks flying in front of him. Looking at the two slender arms in front of him, he laughed dryly and said in a low voice, "Just hold it for a while. Be careful that it doesn't grow together." Chapter 419. Nicole had already noticed the strange gazes around her. When she heard Eric's words, she quickly let go of her hand. She regretted that she had lost her composure when she saw Elizabeth's provocative eyes. That would only embarrass Eric. After she sat down, Nicole took the initiative to give Eric an apologetic look. Elizabeth, however, seemed to have the upper hand. She raised her chin slightly and snorted proudly. Eric patted Nicole gently to comfort her before he turned around and whispered in Elizabeth's ear, "Girl, don't forget where you are. If you dare to embarrass me again, I'll make sure you can't do anything. Try me if you don't believe me." Elizabeth noticed that Eric was comforting Nicole. She was already a little jealous. When she heard this, the little flame in her heart suddenly ignited. Just as she was about to explode, she saw Eric's extremely serious expression. She immediately shrunk her neck and muttered something about being biased. There was also a little grievance on her face. Seeing that the little wild cat had been tamed, Eric was not stingy. He reached out and patted the back of Elizabeth's hand that was on her thigh. Elizabeth turned her head away in a fit of pique and made an expression that said, "I'm not buying it." However, she did not shake off Eric's big hand. Instead, she raised a finger and tickled Eric's palm. It was like a hint between a man and a woman when they were on a date. At the same time, a smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. In fact, there were no secrets in the Hollywood circle. Everyone knew about Eric and the few women. Originally, when they noticed the confrontation between the two women, many people were waiting to see Eric make a fool of himself. However, they saw that Eric had calmed the two women down in a few moves. He did not even need to change some of his little tricks. He used them on the two women at the same time. They could not help but admire Eric's methods. Cage, who was sitting on the left of Eric, even secretly gave Eric a thumbs up. After a brief interlude, the lights in the auditorium gradually dimmed. Soon the announcer's speech appeared on stage. "Let's welcome the host of the 63rd Academy Awards, Billy Crystal." As soon as he finished speaking, a symphony filled with tension rang out in the auditorium. Some people subconsciously turned to look at the crew of The Silence of the Lambs with a look of surprise on their faces. This symphony was the one that played when Professor Hannibal was fully armed and escorted to meet the senator. It had never happened before that the Academy Awards ceremony started with the soundtrack of a horror film. The filmmakers who had received the same nomination as The Silence of the Lambs had a bad feeling. Before many people could figure out the meaning behind it, the curtains on the stage were pulled open. Two men in white who looked like doctors pushed out Proportional Crystal, who was wearing a Hannibal mask. The crowd burst into laughter. After Billy Crystal was put down from the cart, he rolled his eyes and looked around. Then he walked off the stage while the background music was still playing. He came to Anthony Hopkins, who was sitting by the aisle, and extended his hand to him. Anthony Hopkins stood up. Billy Crystal signaled the band to stop playing and said to Anthony Hopkins, "I've prepared a few Oscars for dinner. Do you want to join us?" Hearing this, the crowd burst into laughter again. Anthony Hopkins didn't have Billy Crystal's comedic talent, so he could only echo, "Anytime." Eric sat behind Anthony Hopkins. When Billy Crystal returned to the stage and the camera moved away, he whispered to Elizabeth beside him, "There's less suspense now." Elizabeth and Julia attended the Oscars together last year. The host of the previous Oscars was also Billy Crystal. At that time, Billy Crystal just walked to the stage obediently. Although the change this time was intentional by the Oscars organizing committee to liven up the atmosphere, it also reflected the direction of the Oscars this year. Elizabeth had done a lot of research on the Oscars in the past few months in order to promote the Oscars. Of course, she knew what it meant. She nodded excitedly and said, "I've already prepared a celebration party. By the way, do you want to come with us later? Of course. But is there only a celebration party? Why? Elizabeth looked at Eric's unabashed expression and blushed slightly. She whispered, "You bad guy, what are you up to now?" Eric was about to continue teasing the girl, but when he saw the camera sweeping over again, he had to return to sitting upright. On the stage, Billy Crystal had already taken off his mask and restored his serious look. He looked at the audience and said, "Wow, it's another Oscars. They brought me here again." In the midst of laughter, Billy Crystal said, "Everyone seems to be very happy tonight. So let's put it this way. No matter who the Oscar goes to in the end, Saddam Hussein is dead. I think everyone is very grateful to the U.S. soldiers who are fighting all over the world." As soon as this sentence was said, the audience took the initiative to applaud. After the applause stopped, Billy Crystal immediately added, "Except for Panama." Laughter rang out again. In the early months of last year, in order to protect its vested interests in the Panama Canal, the United States launched an invasion of this small country. Although it was only a short sentence, it deeply reflected Hollywood's righteous and anti-war stance. On the one hand, Hollywood was a staunch supporter of the interests of the United States. Even if the purpose of the country's war was not very open, Hollywood would not sing a different tune from the entire country. Just like when the Iraq War broke out, which most people opposed in the original spacetime, the Oscars that year were held in a very low-key manner. On the other hand, Hollywood was a gathering place for anti-war people. Even if the war had been launched, Hollywood's anti-war stance would still not change. Billy Crystal then teased Madonna, who was about to perform live at this year's Oscars, and then began to sing songs about the nominated films. Eric did not like this segment very much, but maybe the Oscar committee felt that Billy Crystal's way of doing a simple introduction of each nominated film, so every time he hosted the Oscars he would keep this segment. After Billy Crystal finished the opening interaction, the ceremony came to the most important segment. As usual, this year's Oscars still opened with the award of Best Supporting Actor. There was no suspense. This year's Best Supporting Actor award fell to Joe Pesci, who starred in Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas. Then there was a series of minor awards. During this time, Nicole also left Eric's side once, and went on stage to award the Best Cinematography award. Intentionally or not, the award ceremony went on for a whole hour. The most high-profile film of this year, The Silence of the Lambs, had not been nominated for a single award. However, Ghost, which Eric did not have any expectations for, unexpectedly won the Best Soundtrack award. As time passed, Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins went on stage together to award the Best Screenplay award, finally bringing the ceremony to a climax. After a simple introduction of the nominees, Jodie Foster opened the envelope for Best Original Screenplay and went up to Anthony Hopkins. The winner of the Best Original Screenplay award is. Anthony Hopkins looked below the stage and paused for a second before saying, "Ghost." There was a round of applause. Bruce Joey Robin, who was sitting at the back, stood up excitedly. He hugged his female companion, and then walked briskly to the crew of Ghost. After another round of hugs and handshakes, Eric also stood up and shook hands with Bruce Joey Robin across from Nicole. Although there had been some unhappiness between the two of them because of the fight for the script, neither of them would mention it now. After all, both of them had gained enough benefits. After the Best Original Screenplay award, Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins did not leave the stage. Instead, they began to introduce the nominees for Best Adapted Screenplay. Then, Jodie Foster read out the name of The Silence of the Lambs. Amidst the applause, the camera swept below the stage and fixed on a bald, bespectacled middle-aged man. It was the screenwriter of The Silence of the Lambs, Ted Tully. Eric smiled as he watched the crew of The Silence of the Lambs stand up to greet Ted Tully. He thought that he had nothing to do, but after shaking hands with Elizabeth, Ted Tully looked at Eric and extended his hand with a smile. Although it was a little sudden, Eric hurriedly stood up and took Ted Tully's hand. "Mr. Williams, thank you. I hope we can work together again in the future," Ted Tully said quickly and nodded at Eric before walking up the stage. The scene of the two shaking hands was recorded by the camera. After Ted Tully left, the cameraman gave Eric a meaningful close-up. The award ceremony that followed seemed to be very strange and lively. When Whoopi Goldberg won the Best Supporting Actress award for Ghost, it seemed normal. But after that, every time The Silence of the Lambs won an award, the winners did not forget to greet Eric when they hugged and celebrated with the crew. Even Jodie Foster, who won the Best Actress award again, smiled and shook hands with Eric when she heard the good news. Everyone who saw this scene had a strange feeling. It was as if some strange person had sneaked in. After watching Jonathan Demme walk up the stage excitedly when he won the Best Director award, The Silence of the Lambs had already won the Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay awards. There was no doubt that The Silence of the Lambs would win the Best Picture award. Elizabeth looked at Jonathan Demme, who was giving his acceptance speech on the stage. After thanking everyone, he deliberately mentioned Eric's name. Thinking of what had just happened, Elizabeth could not help but say to Eric, "It's over. Maybe everyone will give you the credit. Why don't you go and receive the Best Picture award later?" Eric gently patted Elizabeth's thigh. "Why do you care what others think? I know that you've worked hard for this movie, so you won this award with a clear conscience." Elizabeth was obviously very pleased with these words, but she was still a little stubborn. What's the use of knowing? When Barbra Streisand walked to the podium to introduce the nominees for Best Picture, although many people present had already confirmed the results, they still could not help but look at the Silence of the Lambs crew. For a woman to win the Best Picture award, as a hint, the winner was likely to be a woman, or at least one of the winners was a woman. Among the producers nominated for Best Picture this year, only The Silence of the Lambs crew's Elizabeth was a woman. The nominees for Best Picture are Asking the Heavens, The Godfather 3, Reversal of Fate, The Silence of the Lambs, and Goodfellas. Then the winner of the Academy Award is. Barbra Streisand opened the envelope in her hand and glanced at the Silence of the Lambs crew. She smiled and said, "The winners are The Silence of the Lambs, Jonathan Demme and Elizabeth Murdoch." The music was accompanied by thunderous applause at the same time. Not only the Silence of the Lambs crew, but many people around stood up to congratulate them. After all, The Silence of the Lambs was good enough that there was not much controversy about the award. Moreover, Elizabeth's identity was enough for most of the people present to stand up and express their goodwill. Although many people would tease the Fox princess in private, no one had the backbone to pretend to be high and mighty at this time. Elizabeth also stood up excitedly at this time. Her face was a little red because of her excitement. Perhaps because she was too happy, the girl gave Eric a hug without any scruples and kissed Eric on the cheek. Then she hugged and shook hands with the others one by one. Then, surrounded by everyone, she and Jonathan Demme went up to the podium to receive the award. Jonathan Demme had just given his acceptance speech. He also understood that he was able to win the second Academy Award, because he was covering for Elizabeth. Therefore, he only said a few words and handed the microphone to Elizabeth. The girl picked up the microphone and looked at the dense crowd below the stage. She organized her words and said, "It's amazing. It's a great honor to be able to win this award. This is the greatest encouragement for me. First of all, I would like to thank the Oscar judges for awarding this award to me. Secondly, I would like to thank everyone in the crew, Jonathan, Judy, Anthony, and everyone involved in this movie. Finally, I would like to thank my father, mother, and sister." When Elizabeth said this, she glanced at the audience below the stage. She blushed slightly and showed a sly look. She mustered up her courage and said, "Well, look at how expectant you are." Chapter 420. Well, look at how expectant you are. Elizabeth glanced at Eric, who was sitting in the audience. She mustered up her courage and said, "Finally, I want to thank Eric Williams. This guy really didn't do anything, but everyone seems to think that we should thank him, so I can only go with the flow." Seeing the girl's attempt to cover up, there was a sudden uproar from the audience. Elizabeth's face became even redder because of this. Because the ceremony was almost over, the final process had reached the free time. During this period, the director of the award ceremony would not restrict the speaking time of the award recipients. Many people could also go on stage or off stage to communicate with the guests present if they wanted to. At this time, many people saw the host, Billy Crystal, walk up the stage again. He walked very familiarly to the girl who was about to escape because of the crowd's uproar. He joked, "Come, Miss Murdoch. You look like you're struggling to hold the Oscar. Let me help you." With that said, Crystal supported Elizabeth with one arm and helped hold the Oscar in the girl's hand with the other. Then he took 2 steps forward and said into the microphone, "Well, the executives of the Hollywood studio just found out with tears in their eyes that a certain guy finally stopped making movies crazily. His movies a few years ago gave everyone a lot of pressure. So, in this joyful Cisco, let's forget about Eric Williams. Tonight's glory is destined to belong to the Silence of the Lambs." With the last burst of laughter, this year's Oscar ceremony finally came to an end. Ghost only won a few small awards, so Firefly did not plan to hold a celebration party. Anyway, after the Oscars, as long as you still had the energy, you could always find a variety of parties to attend. Eric directly announced that everyone was dismissed. The celebration party for The Silence of the Lambs was not held in a hotel, but in a mansion of the Murdoch family in Beverly Hills. Eric had just gotten into his car when he saw a petite figure follow him in. She hugged Eric and kissed him. "Eric, Oscar, where's the Oscar?" Drew did not appear at the ceremony this time, but the girl had been waiting outside. Eric pulled the girl away from him and said with a smile, "Why would I have an Oscar? They're all with Liz. They're still being interviewed later." When Drew heard this, he jumped out of the car. Eric ignored the crazy girl and waved at Nicole, who was not far away. The girl walked over and got into the car. Eric gestured for the driver to go to the Beverly Hills celebration banquet for The Silence of the Lambs. He then raised the partition in the driver's seat, and the car slowly started. At this moment, Nicole's feelings were extremely complicated. To the audience, the Oscars ceremony was just a lively Hollywood event. However, to the celebrities who attended the ceremony in person, after seeing others climb up the podium one by one to enjoy victory and glory, no one was willing to be a spectator. After the car had stabilized, Eric looked at Nicole's expression and suddenly asked, "Are you envious?" Nicole nodded honestly and said, "I'm just thinking about when I'll get an Oscar." Eric looked at Nicole and said, "You're too beautiful. The Oscars have always been biased against beautiful women." Nicole reached out and hugged Eric's arm. She leaned on him and said in a flattering tone, "Not even you?" Eric reached out and hugged the girl. He felt the touch of Nicole's slender waist through the silk gown and said, "Of course you can, but do you really want to get an Oscar?" Nicole said, "I don't believe there's an actress in Hollywood who doesn't want it. If you want an Oscar, it's not impossible." Seeing Nicole's sparkling eyes, Eric continued, "But you need to devote yourself to it for 2 to 3 years. During this time, you may not be able to take care of commercial films. Therefore, there is a great risk. In the end, you may not get an Oscar, and your personal value will shrink because you focus too much on literary films." Although the Oscars were very attractive, Nicole would never give up her development in commercial films for the sake of an Oscar. When she heard Eric say this, Nicole was a little doubtful and said, "It shouldn't be like that, right?" Eric explained, "Of course it will be like that for you. First of all, you have to choose an artistic film script that has the potential to compete for an Oscar. You also have to ensure that you can produce an excellent film that meets the taste of the Oscar judges. After the test screening and other measures have been taken to confirm that the film is good enough, it will be a long warm-up and promotion process. This standard process usually takes a few months, so the energy you have to spend is not as simple as just shooting the film. You also have to personally participate in various public relations and promotions. After the various pre-screening film awards have attracted enough attention, it will be the public relations for the Oscars. After this complete process is completed, you may successfully be nominated for an Oscar. But with your qualifications, age, appearance, and other factors, it is impossible to win an award when you are nominated for the first time. Therefore, you have to go through this process at least 2 to 3 times, and even then, if you want to win an Oscar, you have to pray that you don't meet a strong enough opponent. Although Nicole somewhat believed Eric's words, she still asked, Although what you said is very reasonable, looking back at the past few Oscars, it seems that the situation you said didn't happen. This year's Jodie Foster, the previous years. I think it was that old lady. Counting back, the winners didn't seem to follow the process you said to compete for an award, right? Eric smiled and said, "This is completely different. What I just said is about the standard process of competing for an Oscar. For the previous films, before they acted, they might not even know that they would be nominated for an Oscar. Since they didn't do that, how did you summarize what you just said?" Of course, Eric summed it up from the memory of his previous life. In a few years, the public relations for the Oscars would become more and more standardized and formulaic. For example, Nicole next to him. In the original Spacetime, Nicole first got nominated for an Oscar for Best Actress through Moulin Rouge, and then successfully won an Oscar for The Hours a year later. A few years later, Jennifer Lawrence went through the standard process again. First, she was nominated for Winter's Bone, and then she was nominated for The Line of Happiness Behind the Dark Clouds. There were many examples of a single film winning an award, such as Julia's Never Compromise or Charlize Theron's The She-Devil. However, although these actresses didn't have many nominations before, they were already successful and had a strong presence in Hollywood by the time they were crowned as the best actresses. In the face of Nicole's endless questions, Eric didn't explain anymore. "Why do you have so many questions?" Nicole leaned on Eric's body and twisted her body. She giggled, and in her heart, she temporarily dismissed the idea of trying for an Oscar. After a while, she thought of something else. "Eric, do you think it's appropriate for me to act in an R-rated comedy like Lethal Cop? Pete said that this movie is too subversive for me." Eric wasn't worried at all. He said, "You're very beautiful, but you're not sweet enough. If you keep acting in romantic comedies, I guarantee that you won't be able to compete with Julia and the others. So you might as well try to expand your acting career early. Try some very unique characters, and try all kinds of movies. That way, you won't be limited by one style." Although Lethal Cop is an R-rated sequel, if Sarah's performance is good, it will be very outstanding. When Nicole heard Eric mention Julia's name, her mind spun, but she got the wrong idea. She asked weakly, You don't want me to compete with Julia Roberts, right?" Eric asked in return, "Do you think I need to do that?" With the development of his career, Eric's vision became wider and wider. What he wanted was for Firefly to continue to grow and expand until it became the unparalleled overlord of Hollywood. Under such circumstances, Eric wouldn't be like before, spending too much effort to figure out the direction of his women's development. As long as they were doing well in their respective fields and didn't ask him for help, Eric usually couldn't be bothered to intervene. However, it was clear that Nicole didn't think so. She always felt that Eric treated her too differently from the other women. Although Eric's attitude towards her changed a lot after that time, Nicole still felt that Eric was always biased towards others. Nicole was silent for a while. She realized that she rarely guessed Eric's true thoughts, and it was the same this time. It only took 40 minutes to travel from the Sacred Civic Auditorium in downtown Los Angeles to Beverly Hills, but when Eric arrived at the Silence of the Lambs party, it was already more than an hour later. Drew and Elizabeth, who came out to greet them, looked suspiciously at Nicole, who was leaning against Eric. As experienced people, of course, they could easily tell that Nicole couldn't hide the traces on her face. Their expressions towards Eric immediately turned sour. Because of Nicole's doubts, Eric specifically told the driver to circle the streets of Los Angeles a few more times and teach the girl a lesson in the car. Faced with Drew and Elizabeth's crusading gazes, Eric's expression didn't change. "Liz, Nicole is a little tired. Take her to a room to rest for a while. I can go in by myself." Elizabeth huffed angrily, but still said coldly to Nicole, "Come with me, Miss Kidman." After that, Elizabeth turned and walked towards the villa. Nicole glanced at Eric, and seeing the man nod, she followed. Seeing the two women leave, the little girl pounced on Eric and asked with a smile, "Eric, does it feel good? Do you want to find time to try it?" Eric reached out and knocked the girl's head. With a serious face he said, "Thinking about these messy things all day long. It seems that it's time to tidy up. Drew's smile didn't change. She smiled and held Eric's arm. As they walked into the villa, she kept saying, "Yes, yes, yes, yes. Tidy up as much as you can. I promise to cooperate." The two walked into the villa. The hall was crowded with people drinking and chatting. Seeing Eric appear, many people took the initiative to greet him. Eric also smiled and greeted them one by one. After chatting with Anthony Hopkins for a while, Eric saw Murdoch walking through the crowd toward him with a smile. Since it was a celebration party for his daughter winning the Best Picture award, of course, Murdoch couldn't not attend. Eric also saw two young men around his age with Murdoch. After the introductions, Eric learned that the two young men were Elizabeth's two brothers. Noticing the indignant look on the two young men's faces, Eric guessed that Murdoch must have taught these two poor kids a lesson by using the story of other people's children. And the other children must be him. He was purely unjustly implicated. However, although they were physically the same age, Eric's mental age was several times older than the two young men, so he didn't care about the two young men's neglect and hostility. After a casual greeting, Murdoch took the initiative to drive the two young men away, and took Eric to a sofa to sit down. Looking at the backs of his two sons, Murdoch couldn't help but sigh. "If Lachlan and James were half as capable as you, I would be able to hand over the business to them without worry." Eric vaguely remembered that Elizabeth had mentioned about her two brothers. Her two brothers were standard playboys, and one of them was even sent to jail for speeding. Hearing Murdoch's sigh, Eric thought for a moment and asked tentatively, "Isn't there still Liz?" Murdoch looked at Eric. Thinking of the relationship between his daughter and Eric, Murdoch was a little worried. Although he was 100% willing for Eric and Elizabeth to be together, and if the two sides could be connected by marriage, with Eric's ability, he would definitely be a great help to the News Corporation. However, Eric had been unwilling to marry his daughter more than a year ago, before the Fireflies had taken shape. The possibility of this happening was even lower now. What's more, with the current scale of Firefly and the ambition shown by Eric, Murdoch was sure that even if Eric and Elizabeth were together, Firefly and the News Corporation could only maintain a good cooperative relationship at most, and would never become a vassal of the News Corporation. Chapter 421. Murdoch was thinking about this, so he ignored the other meaning of Eric's question. Therefore, he answered somewhat straightforwardly, "Liz is just a woman after all. I still hope that Lachlan and James can take over my position." Eric did not say anything. Murdoch was born in a conservative family in Australia, and his patriarchal ideology was not much weaker than that of Asians. If Elizabeth could not achieve overwhelming success, it would not be easy for her to take charge of News Corporation in the future. After casually chatting about the Oscars, Murdoch talked about the recent series of big moves made by Firefly. It was now approaching April, and the new summer would begin at the end of May. Firefly would have two movies, Toy Story and Terminator 2, released at the same time during the summer. Although the trailer of Toy Story was played at the Super Bowl 2 months ago, it was completely unknown whether this 3D animated film, which was completely different from the traditional 2D animation style, would be accepted by the audience. As a giant or monopolist in the Hollywood animation industry, Disney felt that its position in the animation field would be threatened after the trailer of Toy Story was played. They did not hesitate to use various channels in their hands to attack Toy Story, openly and covertly. In order to prevent the film from being finalized because of competitors' defamation before it was released, Firefly had set a promotional budget of US $20 million for Toy Story, in North America alone, which was equivalent to 50% of the production cost of this animated film. The situation of Terminator 2 seemed to be even worse. Because of the precedent of Abyss, many people thought that Cameron would once again indulge in the exploration of film technology and make a film that was praised but not well received. What's more, everyone knew that Terminator 2 had become the first film in Hollywood history to cost more than 100 million yuan. Including the marketing investment, if the film wanted to recoup its cost in the box office, it would need at least US $300 million worldwide. The global box office of Cameron's last film, Abyss, was only 80 million yuan. In the eyes of outsiders, Firefly would face tremendous pressure to recoup its investment. Due to the fact that Firefly sold the rights to the hit movie Dark War to Columbia before the Oscars, many companies thought that Firefly was facing a financial crisis. The 7 major Hollywood film companies encountered this situation every 1 or 2 years. Therefore, even the well-run Warner or Disney had debts of no less than $1 billion. Although Eric had participated in 2 consecutive oil futures market fluctuations in the first half of the year, Firefly didn't do much after that. Therefore, everyone concluded that Eric didn't make too much profit from this oil crisis. Therefore, Murdoch's mind became active. Perhaps this was another opportunity to invest in Firefly. Although Eric's character was somewhat stubborn, there was no harm in trying. After chatting with Eric for a while, Murdoch asked, "Eric, Firefly even sold Dark War. Their funds must be very tight during this period, right?" "It's okay." Eric immediately understood what the old man meant. He seemed to have heard similar words last year. That time, it was Murdoch who personally delivered them to his door. But this time, Eric had no intention of making any concessions. He finally had complete control of Firefly. Unless it was a last resort, he wouldn't bring in any more shareholders. "Mr. Murdoch, Firefly has just returned to me, so I won't sell any more shares. I think we'd better not talk about this topic anymore. Maybe we can talk about something else." Murdoch smiled when he saw Eric's direct rejection. He didn't have much hope in the first place, so Eric's rejection wasn't too disappointing. He just put on the airs of an elder and said earnestly, "Eric, investing in movies is a very risky activity. If you're not careful, you may lose everything. Therefore, using cooperation to share the risk is a very cost-effective thing to do. I think your bet on Terminator 2 is too big." James Cameron's last movie Abyss caused Fox to lose more than $20 million. But this doesn't have much impact on Fox, because this movie was co-invested by Fox and several other investors. Although the loss was huge, it wasn't much when it was shared among Fox. "You can't say that," Eric replied. "Co-invested movie projects are basically not valued by the movie companies, or they don't have much confidence in them. But the movie companies will definitely not let outsiders interfere with their own A-series. For example, Warner will definitely not co-develop Batman with outsiders, and the Star Wars series will definitely not attract external investors." Murdoch saw that Eric was not fooled, so he said, "Speaking of which, you promised Fox to release The Kid in the Home. There was no news last year. This year, you can't delay anymore. That Stuart Runkle is already 10 years old. If he's 2 years older, he probably won't be suitable for the male lead anymore. At present, we have already contacted CAA. The price they offered last year was too outrageous, so Firefly temporarily shelved this project. Eric, since you can sell Dark War, do you think it's possible to transfer the copyright of The Kid in the Home to Fox?" Eric quickly thought about Murdoch's suggestion. He had already had such an idea before. According to Firefly's internal evaluation, the cost of the third The Kid in the Home series would be between $40 million and $50 million, and the North American box office was estimated to only be about $100 million. Then this sequel was likely to be profitable only through overseas distribution, videotapes, and other peripherals. Perhaps selling the development rights of this project directly was the best choice. Although this might make less money, Firefly would save a lot of time and energy, which could be invested in other more valuable projects. However, Eric did not intend to sell all the copyright of The Kid in the Home. The plan to acquire Disney had been secretly carried out. Once this plan was successful, The Kid in the Home, which had a very important position in the hearts of children, would bring in a lot of profits through Disney's full development channels and the Kid in the Home theme project at Disneyland. "Mr. Murdoch, I won't transfer the copyright of The Kid in the Home, but Firefly really doesn't have much time and energy to spend on this project. So if Fox is interested, Firefly can authorize Fox to develop the sequel." Murdoch thought about it for a while and agreed. However, neither of them was in a hurry to discuss the specific cooperation agreement. The copyright of The Kid in the Home already involved too many things and could not be negotiated in a short period of time. They could only leave it to the staff of Firefly and Fox to slowly negotiate. After the Oscar ceremony, the media naturally commented on this year's Oscars. The Silence of the Lambs relied on its excellent quality. Although it did not feel guilty about winning the award, it still received a lot of questions as usual. However, neither the winner nor the Academy of Film made any response to these questions. Because it was repeatedly mentioned at the award ceremony, the scene on stage when Elizabeth won Best Picture was even more memorable for many people. For the TV audience, perhaps Eric was just a topic of conversation, but in Hollywood, this situation also indicated that Eric's influence was growing. As Billy Crystal teased at the end, the executives of the Hollywood studio finally found out that Eric was no longer crazy enough to make several movies every year. But this guy appeared at the Oscar ceremony again. Although none of the 7 major film companies treated the Oscars as their main business, the influence and surrounding economic benefits brought by the Oscars was still a big cake. In the past few years, most of this cake belonged to the 7 major film companies. Eric's sudden intervention once again made them feel like they were facing a formidable enemy. However, all of this did not affect Eric at all. The preliminary preparations for Tornado had been completed. As many as 200 people had been sent to Oklahoma in batches, and could start filming at any time. Eric stayed in Los Angeles for a few more days to finalize the negotiations with Fox for the licensing of Home Alone. Firefly planned to produce and release 5 movies this year. Before the Oscars, 4 movies had been confirmed: Toy Story, Terminator 2, Dumb and Melon, and Tough Cop. During the last few days of Eric's stay in Los Angeles, he finally confirmed the last movie. It was the sequel to New Line's original signature series, A Nightmare on Elm Street. Because of the box office failure of the 4th installment in the Nightmare on Elm Street series, Robert Shea originally planned to make a sequel when he was still at Firefly. There were even some first drafts of the script. What Eric did was to completely finalize the project and temporarily name it Freddy's Death. Unless this sequel could be a big hit, after the 5th installment, Eric would temporarily shelve the project and wait for 8 or 10 years, when Hollywood remakes were popular. In addition to A Nightmare on Elm Street, Eric also did not forget to pay attention to Disney's Throat Cut Island. The movie had already started filming in February. Disney had not stopped promoting Throat Cut Island since the project was established. At the Oscars ceremony, they had specially arranged a guest role for director Rennie Harlin and Gina Davis. They even revealed to the media that Eric was originally optimistic about the script. According to a series of news in various newspapers and media, Throat Cut Island was being shot in the Mediterranean island of Malta, and it might even be transferred to Thailand for on-site filming. The TV station would occasionally release some highlights. Moreover, it was said that the original investment of the movie was set at $70 million, but because of the rush, there were obvious signs of overspending. Disney and Robert Shea were also single. After learning that Terminator 2 had invested more than $100 million, they simply announced that the cost of Throat Cut Island would also exceed $100 million. Although there were still 3 months before the release of the 2 movies, Throat Cut Island and Terminator 2 were already sparks flying. The media was also very keen to compare the 2 movies together. Eric always had an inexplicable sense of humor when he saw such news. The only comparison between the 2 movies in the original spacetime might be that they were recorded in the history of Hollywood movies. In New York, while taking care of the Firefly investment, Chris had not relaxed the absorption of Disney shares. In February, he also bought the largest 0.9% stake from a Disney shareholder. Chris expected to be able to absorb a total of about 10% of Disney shares through several different channels before July. At that time, if the goodwill acquisition did not succeed, Eric could use the funds and chips in his hands to launch a hostile acquisition with an overwhelming advantage over Disney. On the 28th of March, Eric took the last batch of people from the cast of Tornado to Oklahoma, which was located in the south-central part of the United States. Compared to the densely populated east and west coasts, the interior of the United States could be described as vast but sparsely populated. Take the state of Oklahoma for example. As the state capital and the largest city in the state, Oklahoma City only had a population of 500,000, and the surrounding population was even sparser. The filming location of Tornado was not in Oklahoma City. Instead, it was near a small city called Ponca in northeastern Oklahoma. The crew built a large number of sets around Ponca City, such as the town where the heroine's Aunt Chio lived, the hotel where the convoy stopped before encountering the huge tornado, and so on. Because these had to be destroyed in the later stages of the movie, it was impossible to rent a real residential building for filming. The biggest movie Eric directed before was Dark War, but the investment of that movie was only more than $30 million, and it was shot in Los Angeles, where all kinds of conditions were very convenient. In contrast, Tornado was the first big movie Eric directed in the true sense. Not only was the movie's investment guaranteed to be $70 million, but all the crew members added up to more than 200 people. In addition to the core of the crew directly controlled by Eric, there were 3 assistant directors in charge of 3 groups. The 3 assistant directors each had a clear division of labor. One was responsible for the shooting of the day, one was responsible for the finishing of the shooting of the day before, and the last group was preparing for the shooting of the day after. In addition to the drama scenes, a large number of tornado scenes needed to be shot on cloudy days as much as possible. Therefore, the shooting plan could not be rigidly fixed on which scene to shoot on a certain day. Instead, the shooting plan needed to be flexibly changed according to the local weather. In order to ensure that the crew shot as much as possible, Eric even asked the logistics team to customize a huge black gauze net of hundreds of square meters. If there was no suitable weather for a long time, the crew would hire several tower cranes to hold up the large net to artificially create a gloomy weather. Chapter 422. In the third week of filming for Tornado, a Boeing passenger plane roared as it landed on the runway at the Oklahoma City airport. Virginia Madsen, who was sitting in the first-class cabin, looked at the wet runway outside the plane window. She was a little happy. If it rained in Punk City, she would be able to have a rest day for the crew. At the end of last year, Virginia received a movie contract from Paramount, but the studio chose to shoot in Northern Ireland. For the movie, Virginia stayed in Northern Ireland for 3 months before returning to the United States. Although Virginia was a very independent woman, she hadn't seen her man for 3 months. She missed him both mentally and physically. As soon as she returned to the United States, she called and asked if she could come over to visit. Eric certainly couldn't refuse. After getting off the plane, Virginia walked out of the airport with her assistant, Sonny. They waited for a while, and a young man in a white baseball cap ran over to them. After greeting them, the young man introduced himself. "Miss Madsen, I'm Peker Hearns. Mr. Williams asked me to pick you up. Come with me," the young man said as he thoughtfully took the luggage from Sonny's hands and gestured for her to go ahead. "Thank you, Mr. Hearns," Virginia said politely and followed the young man out of the airport. "Miss Madsen, you can call me Peker." The 3 of them got into a black Chevrolet MPV and Virginia asked, "Peker, did the crew start work today?" Peker Hearns felt strange at first, but when he thought about the weather outside, he understood why Virginia asked that. He said, "Of course, Ms. Madsen. For our movie, cloudy weather is our dream. We've been filming for 3 weeks and we've only had 4 days in total. As long as it doesn't rain too heavily, we'll continue working as usual." Virginia was a little disappointed when she heard Peker's words. It was only Tuesday. If the crew did not rest today, they would have to wait until the weekend. She could only stay here for 3 days because of her work schedule. On Friday, she had to fly to New York to attend a commercial event for her brand. Because of the contract, she could not cancel the event. Her man was a workaholic, so he would not have much time to accompany her during the workday. Punk City was about 100 kilometers away from Oklahoma City. Because of the highway, it only took them 1.5 hours to arrive. Although the weather was gloomy, it did not look like it was going to rain at all. The hotel where the crew was staying was empty. After arranging the rooms for Virginia and her assistant, Peker Hearns asked, "Miss Madsen, do you want to wait here for the crew or go to the set now?" "Let's go to the set." Virginia's voice was calm, but she could not hide her eagerness. Of course, Peker Hearns would not expose her. He nodded politely and looked at Virginia's outfit. He said, "If we go to the set now, you'd better change into something more casual. At least, you can't wear high heels." Virginia was wearing a burgundy suit and skirt. She had specially chosen this because Eric liked her the most. However, after hearing Peker Hearns' words, she quickly went back to her room and changed. When she came out again, she was wearing an ordinary jacket, jeans, and a pair of flat boots. Peker Hearns swallowed his saliva and looked at Virginia's thighs that were wrapped in jeans. He could not help but be envious of Eric's luck. This time, they got on an off-road vehicle and quickly drove out of Punk City. This time, the road was no longer as flat as before. It was a relatively narrow cement road. After half an hour of bumpy driving through the fields, Virginia looked through the car window and saw a crane's mechanical arm extending into the air from afar. As they walked forward, they could faintly hear the roar of the crane. Peker Hearns noticed the confusion on Virginia's face and explained, "That's the sound of a Boeing engine." In order to create a more realistic hurricane effect, the crew rented it from Boeing. Virginia could imagine the terrifying wind created by a Boeing engine that could lift a few hundred tons into the sky. She could not help but exclaim that her man was crazy. Her assistant was also surprised. "A Boeing engine? That thing won't blow people away, right?" Peker Hearns seemed to be satisfied with the surprise on their faces. He said, "Of course, if you get too close, you'll be blown away. However, you'll be fine as long as you keep a certain distance." The off-road vehicle soon arrived at the set. The crew guarding the perimeter saw Peker Hearns' work pass and let the vehicle in. Virginia and her assistant, Sunny, got out of the vehicle. The roar of the Boeing engine became even louder. The filming location was in a muddy canal. There were crew members everywhere. All kinds of filming equipment were scattered around the canal. On the other side of the canal, there was a huge crane. The end of the crane's mechanical arm seemed to be connected to a farm tractor. After sending the two girls there, Peker Hearns had completed his mission. He said a few words to Virginia and headed to a makeshift house not far away. Everyone in the crew was busy, so Virginia did not disturb them. She stood about 10 meters away and looked around for a while. However, she could not find Eric. After more than 10 minutes, the roar of the Boeing engine stopped. Virginia braced herself and thought that the crew would take a break. However, she saw a wet person crawling out from under the wooden bridge. Virginia recognized that it was Eric's personal cameraman, Nickel Frank. She waved at him. When Nickel saw Virginia, he revealed his white teeth and waved at her. However, he ran in the opposite direction. Virginia saw Nickel say something to a crew member loudly. Then he quickly took something that looked like a camera lens from the logistics department and rushed back into the canal. A moment later, someone shouted action through a loudspeaker, and the roar of the engine sounded again. Virginia's assistant, Sunny, was a little confused by the noise. She pulled Virginia's sleeve and said loudly, "Vicky, why don't we stand a little further away and wait? That seems to be the place where the actors rest." Virginia also knew that this scene could take more than 10 shots. It might take more than an hour or two to complete. She nodded and was about to leave when Nickel came out again and walked towards them. "Let's go over there," Nickel said loudly as he came to the two of them and pointed to the actors' lounge. After walking a little further, although it was already a little noisy, it no longer affected their conversation. Nickel took off his muddy jacket and asked for a towel from the staff to wipe his face. The white towel quickly turned gray. After wiping his face, Nickel threw the towel directly into the trash can. Seeing that Nickel had cleaned up a little, Virginia smiled and reached out her hand. "Nickel, long time no see." Nickel reached out his hand but quickly withdrew it. Seeing Virginia's puzzled look, he explained with a smile, "I don't need to shake hands, Miss Matson. I just got out of the muddy water, and I'm not very clean. I heard that the muddy water here can cause hepatitis. Everyone in the crew has been vaccinated against hepatitis." Virginia showed a look of understanding and asked, "Well, where's Eric? I don't seem to see him." Nickel pointed to the canal and said, "He's filming there himself." Virginia thought of Nickel's miserable appearance when he came out of the canal. She thought that Eric might also be soaked in the dirty muddy water. She looked over there with some distress and said, "Aren't you a photographer?" Nickel did not notice anything special in Virginia's tone. He said, "This is the first time we've filmed such a scene." Eric wanted to see the most intuitive effect, so he did it himself. You may not know this, but Eric's photography skills are no worse than mine. I really don't know how he learned it. Just as they were talking, they saw the crane suddenly start up, and a farm tractor flew up into the air. "This is the scene of the tractor being hung up by the tornado," Nickel said and patted his head again. "Oh, I forgot to tell Eric that you're here." No need. He's so busy. Anyway, I have nothing to do. I'll just wait here." Virginia quickly waved her hand. "Okay then." Nickel quickly finished the coffee that the staff handed over. He stood up and said, "I'll get to work first. I still have to set up the camera for the next scene. I won't accompany you." Seeing Nickel leave, Virginia's assistant, Sunny, could not help but smack her lips. She was hired by Virginia at the beginning of the year, so she had never seen Eric before. However, at this time, after seeing everything around her, she suddenly had a great interest in Eric. She was now 26 years old, and only had a small role as an assistant. She had fought hard for this job. She heard that the young man was only 20 years old, but he was already able to control such a huge crew and had a film company like Firefly. Vicky, that Mr. Williams, what kind of person is he? Virginia was stunned. As her personal assistant, Sunny couldn't hide a lot of personal matters from her. Therefore, when they came, Virginia took the initiative to reveal some things to Sunny. At this time, when she heard Sunny's question, she did not know how to answer for a while. After thinking for a while, she said, "I don't know how to say it. In short, he is a very special person. You will know when you see him." Sunny nodded and wanted to ask more, but she remembered the advice of a good friend when she got the job. She swallowed the words that were about to come out of her mouth, because her friend told her that the most important thing to be a celebrity's assistant was to put away her curiosity. Sunny's education level was not high. She only studied at a community college for 2 years before dropping out. It was not easy for her to get this job with a good salary. She did not want to lose it because of her curiosity. Because the filming site was relatively noisy, the two were not in the mood to chat. They had been silently watching the filming site not far away. He watched as the crane lifted the tractor up, and another truck flew into the air. In the end, the wooden planks on the wooden bridge also flew up in a mess, coupled with the debris flying in the man-made hurricane on the scene. Although the tornado still needed to be added in post-production, seeing this scene, Sunny already felt that this movie would definitely surprise people. The two arrived at the set at 10 o'clock. After waiting for 2 hours, the morning shooting finally ended and the noisy environment finally quieted down. Virginia got up and walked over to the ditch. Soon, she saw a man and a woman covered in mud getting out of the ditch with the help of the staff. Virginia did not know the man, but she was sure that he should be the male lead of Tornado. As for the other woman, although she was in a sorry state, Virginia immediately noticed the woman's slender eyes. Even though her body was dirty and her face was covered in mud, her pair of beautiful eyes made people feel that she was definitely a great beauty at first glance. The woman did not notice Virginia looking at her. With the help of her assistant, she quickly walked to a nearby makeshift room. Virginia guessed that it should be the bathroom. Before the woman's figure disappeared, Virginia heard a familiar voice. "Vicky, you're here." Virginia turned her head and saw Eric, who was covered in dirt. At this time, the man was holding a camera wrapped in a plastic sheet. "Eric," Virginia called softly. Looking at Eric covered in grayish-black mud, she took 2 steps forward with some heartache. She saw an assistant coming over with a towel in her hand. Virginia took it and reached out to wipe Eric. "No, I'll do it myself." Eric handed the camera to someone else and took the towel from Virginia to wipe his face to prevent the mud from getting into his eyes. Then he said, "There's hepatitis virus here. I have to take a shower first. Wait a while, I'll be done soon." Virginia nodded. After Eric left, Sunny, who had been standing not far away, came over. Seeing Eric's figure disappear, she stuck out her tongue and said, "He's Eric Williams." Virginia knocked on Sunny's head and said, "What's wrong? Is there a problem?" No, I just feel. You feel that he's just like that, nothing special?" Sunny nodded. Virginia did not explain. She looked at the good-looking assistant and thought to herself, if you feel that he's special, you might have already fallen for him. Chapter 423. Nothing much happened during the morning shoot, but as lunchtime arrived, the atmosphere of the tornado crew in the field in the suburbs became a little strange. Most of the people became quiet when they talked and did things. Occasionally, someone would make too much noise when they moved the equipment, which would attract everyone's attention. Although everyone seemed to be minding their own business, they couldn't help but glance at Virginia. The filming of Tornado had been going on for 3 weeks. Even the most obtuse of the crew members knew about the relationship between Eric and Joanna by now. Everyone was curious about what would happen when Virginia, who also had a relationship with Eric, suddenly came to visit. However, it was disappointing that the confrontation between the two women didn't happen, and the two women didn't even come into contact with each other. After Joanna took a shower, she chatted with Eric for a while before she went to have lunch with several main actors. Eric got someone to call Virginia's assistant, Sunny, and took 2 lunches for himself before he brought Virginia into a trailer. After the door was closed, Virginia finally didn't have to hide anymore. She threw herself into Eric's arms and hugged him. After a while, Eric let go of the girl and smiled. "You must be hungry. Let's eat first, but the food here isn't good, so you can only make do with it." Virginia knew that it wasn't the time, so she sat down at the table with Eric. However, she still couldn't help sitting beside Eric instead of opposite him. Eric handed Virginia a straw from a box of juice and said, "Didn't you go to Ireland? I haven't been there yet. How did it feel to film in Ireland?" Virginia immediately showed a little complaint. "It's very cold. If I knew, I wouldn't have accepted this movie. I almost froze to death. Kapoor said that this movie might let me get an Oscar nomination, so he persuaded me to accept it. He only gave me $3 million. Eric thought of something and said, "Speaking of which, Paramount even specially sent the script to me for a look." Virginia immediately asked, "What do you think? Is it possible to get nominated?" Eric carefully recalled the script. It was a story about a man who went bankrupt after many years of wandering outside. He returned to his hometown in Northern Ireland to live in seclusion, and met a young single mother. The theme of the movie was very central. It was about family, kinship, and the attitude towards life. As long as this type of movie could be filmed in a heartwarming manner, even if it did not win an award, the box office would still be guaranteed. The theme of the movie is too warm. The Oscars still prefer things that are more profound, so the chances of winning an award are not high. However, there is still a high chance of being nominated. By the way, how much did the movie cost? Virginia said, "About $15 million. The male lead isn't very famous, so his salary isn't very high. But his acting skills are very good. I'm often suppressed by him. It's so awkward." Eric remembered that the male lead in the script was a middle-aged man in his 30s. Although Virginia's acting wasn't at the level of a movie queen, it was impossible for her to be easily suppressed, not to mention that it was an unknown actor. This made him curious and asked, "What's the name of the male lead?" "Kevin Spacey." "Oh, who is it?" Eric hesitated for a moment before he realized who it was. He asked again to confirm. "Kevin Spacey," Virginia repeated. When she saw Eric's expression, she was puzzled and said, "He's just an unknown actor. I think he used to act in stage plays. Do you know him?" Eric said, "Yeah, I've heard of this name occasionally. I remember that he played a small role in Harrison Ford and Melanie Griffith's Working Girl 2 years ago." After saying this, the two of them didn't continue the topic. Eric initially thought that since Kevin Spacey was still unknown, maybe he could ask Caper to find a way to sign him. However, he realized that he had nothing to do with the management company now, so he gave up on the idea. "Hey, Eric." Virginia sipped a few mouthfuls of juice, hesitated, and said, Should I go and say hello to her?" Eric knew that Virginia was talking about Joanna. He smiled and said, "Forget about it now. Let's go back to Punk City after work today. We'll have dinner together. You mean the three of us have dinner together? How about I leave, and you two can talk alone, but you have to promise that you won't fight. Virginia laughed and said, Oh, don't even think about it. If us women fight over you, you'll be even happier. Not to mention that we're not little girls anymore. After a simple lunch, the crew quickly began their intense filming. Although Oklahoma was not like Los Angeles, which had sunny days for more than 300 days a year, northern Oklahoma was still sunny most of the time in early summer. It was not easy to encounter cloudy weather. Although Virginia didn't leave, she couldn't help much. She had to stay in the trailer with her assistant. In the afternoon, the set was still as noisy as before. It was still the scene of the male and female protagonists encountering the tornado in the ditch. For such a big-budget special effects movie, Eric couldn't copy it exactly according to the pictures in his memory. Many of the scenes were brand new. Therefore, Eric had to accumulate enough shooting materials. Although the first tornado scene was not the biggest scene in the movie, if it was res hot because the shooting materials couldn't be used, it would not only be a problem of funding, but it would also involve the post-production special effects. Although he couldn't completely copy the tornado in his mind, and even modified many parts of the script, Eric was still full of confidence in this movie. After all, the main attraction of Tornado was the realistic hurricane special effects in the movie. Although the script was modified, the tight rhythm of the movie didn't change. Eric made a detailed analysis of the original movie. In addition to the foreshadowing at the beginning and the high level of the hurricane at the end, the rhythm of the middle part was basically 5 to 10 minutes between the scenes and the special effects rotation. It would not make the audience feel bored because the scenes were too long, and it wouldn't cause aesthetic fatigue because there were too many special effects scenes. The roar of the Boeing engine was tossed around for the whole afternoon. When it was close to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the scene finally ended. In the remaining hour, it was impossible for the crew to go to other scenes, so they began to methodically pack up the equipment and prepare to return to Punk City. Eric opened the door of the trailer and saw Virginia leaning against the small trailer in boredom. She was holding a meteorology book specially prepared by the crew, and she had a headset in her ear. When the assistant named Sunny saw Eric appear, she stood up and said hello, and tactfully left the trailer. It's finally over? Virginia took off the headset and sat up and asked. Eric nodded and said, Well, we can go back to Punk City soon. Let's go take my car. This car won't go back to Punk City. The driver will drive directly to the next filming location. Virginia followed Eric out of the trailer and a cool breeze blew. Virginia looked up at the gloomy sky and suppressed the little expectation in her heart and said, It's not going to rain, right? Eric looked at the low clouds and said, The weather forecast said that there may be light rain tonight, and it may be cloudy tomorrow. Virginia followed Eric for 2 steps and felt a cool breeze enter her collar. She said, I just read in the book that Oklahoma is in the tornado corridor. Looking at the weather, there won't be a tornado, right? A tornado is not something fun. You can just look forward to some rain. Forget about this. Seeing that Eric had exposed her thoughts, Virginia blushed. It wasn't a small matter to stop the production of the movie. There were hundreds of people in the crew, and even if they did nothing, they would have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars every day. Even if Eric was rich, it was impossible to play like this. In order to let Eric spend more time with her, she looked forward to a rainy day. She was indeed a spendthrift. I just didn't look forward to rain. Virginia guiltily glanced at Eric and weakly defended herself. During dinner, Jeffrey also rushed back from another set. When he saw Virginia coming over, he just said hello and gave up the plan to use dinner time to talk with Eric. Eric didn't take the 2 women out for dinner. He just chose the small restaurant inside the hotel booked by the crew. Punk City was only a small town with a population of more than 20,000 people. The huge presence of the crew had attracted too much attention. Although the large wave of reporters attracted by the crew at the beginning of filming had mostly dispersed, occasionally there would still be 2 or 3 people here, trying to dig up some news. If Eric swaggered with the 2 women on the street, it would definitely be in the headlines tomorrow. There was no confrontation between the two women, at least on the surface. They got along very well. Virginia and Joanna were very clear that they were just Eric's lovers. Because of the age gap, the possibility of marrying this little man was zero, so there was nothing to fight about. Although Virginia's tone occasionally had a little bit of scheming, Joanna's character was like water. She was calm and didn't fight. Even if Virginia wanted to provoke something, it was unlikely. This situation made Eric very satisfied. The dinner lasted for more than an hour. At 7 o'clock in the evening, looking at the two women who were still chatting happily, Eric stood up and said, "You two continue chatting. I'm going to look at today's shooting materials and discuss with Stan about the special effects. I'll try to come back at 10 o'clock." After Eric left, Virginia and Joanna, who were chatting, became quiet at the same time. They picked up the coffee in front of them at the same time. The atmosphere lasted for a moment, and Virginia laughed. "Finally, we don't have to accommodate that little bastard anymore." Joanna also laughed. The two women had been very tacitly maintaining a harmonious attitude just now, because they didn't want Eric to worry too much. He's been very tired these days. He rarely goes to bed before 12 o'clock. Every day he has to get up at 6 o'clock sharp, Joanna said. She seemed to be explaining something, but soon she realized that it sounded a little strange. It was as if she had been living in the same room with Eric. In the end, Joanna couldn't help but explain, "That? I live next door to him." There was a huge warehouse in the south of the hotel where Eric lived. It used to store corn, but now it had been transformed into a large studio. There were all kinds of movie equipment, and more than 10 computers inside. Although it was night time, the team in charge of the special effects of Tornado in the digital field was still busy at this time. Eric, Stan Winston, and several other special effects artists were discussing the special effects processing plan based on the materials that had been shot over the past few days. Although the hardware facilities were enough to satisfy the special effects of Tornado, it was the first time that they had done a movie that involved a large number of CG scenes. Everyone needed to slowly think about it, and occasionally, they needed to develop special solutions for certain scenes. Large-scale destruction of scenes will definitely be a very important branch of the computer special effects field in the future. Although this small program can satisfy the needs of this movie, it's still too limited. Stan, get someone to prepare a detailed plan. I'll get someone in San Francisco to develop a similar application. Stan Winston nodded. The two of them pointed at a completely gray scene on the computer screen that hadn't been rendered. Stan Winston said, "Leave the rest to us. Eric, maybe you should go back and rest." Eric made a sound of confusion. He looked at his watch. It was only 9:30. He noticed the look on Stan Winston's face and suddenly felt a little embarrassed. Stan Winston patted Eric on the shoulder and winked unscrupulously. "If there's a need, maybe we can start work a little later tomorrow. No one will say anything." "Forget it, it was done a long time ago," Eric said. When he saw the teasing looks on everyone's faces after hearing Stan's words, he didn't insist on staying. He said a few more words and quickly left the studio. When he returned to the hotel and walked into the room, he saw Virginia, who had already changed into pajamas, leaning against the sofa in the living room and watching TV. Eric had already given the room card to the hostess, so he wasn't surprised. Virginia sat up and curiously asked, "Didn't you say 10 o'clock? "I was kicked out," Eric said with a shrug. Virginia thought of a possibility and smiled shyly. It's okay, right? Will I affect your work?" "Of course not." Eric took off his jacket, walked to the bathroom and said, "I'll take a shower first." Virginia turned off the TV and got up to turn off the lights in the room, leaving only a dim wall lamp on. Chapter 424. When it was close to midnight, it was still raining outside the window, but the rain didn't disturb Eric at this time. Virginia lazily leaned against Eric and murmured in a low voice, "How nice would it be if it could go on like this forever?" Eric pinched the woman's face and teased, "You're not a teenage girl anymore. How can you have such messy thoughts?" Virginia shook her head and looked at Eric with dissatisfaction. "Ugh, you're so annoying. You're only 20 years old. Can't you say some sweet nothings that a kid your age should say to coax a woman? Eric smiled and said, I can't say that. It's mainly because we're so familiar with each other. It's too mushy to say such words. Virginia seemed to be interested. She propped herself up slightly and looked at Eric. She opened her eyes wide and looked at Eric. Dear, say something. I want to hear it. Eric quickly raised his hands and surrendered. Stop, don't talk in such a tone. My hair is standing up. Okay, I'll think about it. Under Virginia's expectant gaze, Eric pondered for a while before stammering, little baby. Listening to Eric's awkward tone, Virginia burst out laughing. Her whole body softened on Eric again, imitating Eric's tone. Little baby. Eric also laughed and said, Okay, stop laughing. It's mainly because I'm too familiar with you that I can't do it. Let's find a nightclub another day, and let you see my ability to pick up girls. Virginia continued to laugh a few times before saying, bragging. Eric said, How is that possible? The last time I went to New York, I directly hooked up 2 girls in a nightclub. But who asked me to stick to my principles? In the end, I went back to the hotel alone. Did they recognize you? Virginia asked, getting straight to the point. Eric was stunned for a moment before he stuttered. This? Virginia chuckled again. If Eric was recognized, then it was almost certain that women would come to him. Even if it wasn't for fame, Eric was still a billionaire after all. Eric didn't have any intention of explaining himself. He allowed Virginia to be overjoyed for a while before saying, Let's sleep. I have to wake up early tomorrow. Virginia quickly calmed down and asked softly, Eric, if you can't even say words of love, then am I still your lover? Eric nodded with certainty. Of course, but I hope that our relationship can be more familial. Virginia dragged out her small voice. I haven't even experienced the taste of love, and it's already become family. I'm so unwilling. Eric turned his head and kissed Virginia's cheek. He said, So what if you're unwilling? Little beauty, do you think you can run away? Virginia rubbed against Eric and muttered, I haven't even worn a wedding dress or a ring. Eric grabbed the girl's small hand. I'll buy you a diamond ring the size of a pigeon egg. How about that? Virginia laughed. Wouldn't that be too exaggerated? Eric showed a look of disdain and said, What kind of ring do you want? Virginia thought for a moment and said, I want you to personally design a ring. It has to be unique. No problem. Eric agreed without hesitation. With this promise, Virginia quickly fell asleep with satisfaction. Eric felt that the wind outside the window seemed to be a little stronger. He got up and closed the window, took a shower and fell asleep. After an unknown amount of time, Eric suddenly heard a hurried knock on the door. He opened his eyes and saw that the sky outside the window was still as dark as ink. He turned on the light and looked at his watch. It was 3 a.m. Feeling Eric's movements and the disturbance of the knock on the door, Virginia also woke up. Seeing Eric hurriedly put on his trousers and walk out, she also sat up and found clothes to wear. It was impossible that the crew members didn't know that she would be in Eric's room tonight. Something must have happened if they knocked on the door at this time. Virginia had just put on her clothes and walked into the living room when she saw Eric walking back with a serious expression. Eric, what happened? Eric returned to the bedroom and found his shirt and jacket to put on. When he saw Virginia's worried look, he shook his head and said, Nothing, I have to go out for a while. Stay here and don't run around. Virginia saw that Eric was hiding something from her, and became even more worried. What happened? Can you tell me? Eric hesitated for a moment before finally saying, A tornado appeared northwest of Punk City at 2 a.m. It swept through the street set by the crew. The staff responsible for guarding it were injured. Jeffrey and I have to rush over now. Eric hurriedly finished speaking and walked out. However, he felt Virginia follow him out of the room. At this time, many doors in the corridor were opened, and the crew members were trying to find out what had happened. No one cared that Virginia had come out of Eric's room. The door on the right side of Eric's room was also opened. Joanna, who was wearing pajamas, saw the commotion in the corridor. Her confused mind quickly cleared up. After asking about the situation, and knowing that Eric was rushing to the scene, she also showed a worried look. The crew was filming Tornado. Joanna, who had read a lot of information, naturally knew the seriousness of the matter. Seeing that Eric was about to leave, Joanna stepped forward and pulled Eric's sleeve. "Eric, do you want me to go with you?" Virginia, who had been following Eric, also immediately said, "I'll go too. Go back to your room. This hotel is built with reinforced concrete. The weather forecast said that there won't be a big storm, so it's very safe here." Eric's voice was very calm and his expression was unquestionable. Knowing that she wouldn't be of much help even if she went, Joanna pulled Virginia, and the two women went back to Joanna's room together. Eric and Jeffrey also quickly left the hotel with a group of people. The roar of car engines could be heard on the street. The two women weren't in the mood to rest anymore. They sat down on the small sofa in Joanna's room. Virginia took the coffee from Joanna, and couldn't help but look at the bright car lights outside the window. She said, "In the afternoon, I said that there might be a tornado. Eric told me not to jinx it. Unexpectedly. I really shouldn't have said that." Joanna also poured a cup of coffee for herself, and sat on the sofa. She comforted her. "It's okay. This has nothing to do with you. Because of this movie, I've been paying more attention to tornadoes. During this period, I've seen several tornadoes in the newspaper. This is very normal in the Central Plains." Virginia sighed again. She could still hear the wind outside the window from time to time. She couldn't help but say, "I hope that Eric will be fine." Joanna blinked her slender eyes and immediately said, "Don't say any more." Virginia froze for a moment, and immediately covered her mouth. In the suburbs about 7 kilometers northwest of Punk City, a street in the town where the heroine's aunt's house was located seemed to have been brutally attacked by some kind of giant beast. Except for the ruins in the southeast direction, because the temporary set wasn't solid at all, the other buildings were also damaged by the wind. They couldn't be used anymore. Under the illumination of several off-road vehicles, an assistant director was introducing the situation to Eric and other senior members of the crew. The 7 staff members responsible for guarding the house were able to hide in the abandoned basement in the south. Except for one who fell in a hurry and his leg may have been fractured, the others only had simple bruises. However, the 7 of them have been taken to the hospital in Punk City by ambulance for examination. Jeffrey was still worried and asked, "Are you sure that there are 7 people? Is there anyone left out?" The assistant director nodded. "I personally arranged it. The workers in charge of setting up the scene are all from the nearby town. They all go back home at night. There are only 7 people here." Eric and Jeffrey had just relaxed. As long as the crew members were fine, then there wouldn't be too much of a problem. Otherwise, they would definitely be entangled with the Union again. Because this movie involved too many thrilling scenes. Several major unions specially stationed people here. They would often point fingers at them. At this time, Eric also understood why so many crews were keen to film in Canada and other places. On one hand, the labor cost was low and the tax rebate was high. But the most important thing was that they wouldn't be restricted by the various unions in the United States. These messy unions were extremely difficult to deal with. Moreover, you have to listen to them. You can't go against them. Otherwise, all their members will be removed in minutes. The assistant director didn't seem to notice the relaxed look on Eric and the others' faces. He continued, "However, the town in the southeast just happened to be swept by the tornado. I heard that 2 people were swept away. They haven't been found yet. There are also many people injured." Eric and Jeffrey looked at each other. They didn't know what to say. In this situation, no one could say that it had nothing to do with them. The assistant director also felt that it was a bit inappropriate to suddenly mention this matter. He had to change the topic. "Then, Mr. Williams, what do we do here? Do we need to rebuild it?" Eric looked at the ruins illuminated by the headlights of several cars and shook his head. "Since this place was destroyed by the tornado, then it's more realistic than the ruins we make in the future. So let's just shoot the scene after the tornado passed through. Also, let's find a similar town as soon as possible and shoot the scene where the female lead's aunt has a meal." Everyone discussed the relevant details again. When they returned to Punk City, the sky was already bright. Perhaps it was because of the gust of wind last night, but the dark clouds in the sky had all disappeared. The orange sun slowly peeked out from the horizon. When they returned to the hotel, Virginia and Joanna came out to greet them. When they saw that Eric was safe and sound, they were relieved. Although only one of the 7 people guarding the set was slightly injured, during the day, the crew was still harassed by the union members. Moreover, the news that the crew encountered the tornado was spread by the reporters who stayed in Punk City. It was published in the newspapers the next day. The more well-known newspapers were able to report it truthfully, but the tabloids didn't have such scruples. In order to attract attention, the published reports were as serious as possible. They even blamed the casualties in the town near the set on the crew. In just a few days, a large group of reporters once again came to Punk City. Seeing that the situation was escalating, Firefly had to publish a formal statement in the Los Angeles Times. They also attached a joint statement from the relevant unions. Only then did the storm calm down. It wasn't known if the sudden tornado had blown away the good luck of the crew. The following shooting began to encounter big and small situations one after another. There was even a car accident. Eric had to set up a special safety team. Because of the delays caused by these situations, the shooting schedule that was originally scheduled to end at the end of June might be delayed by at least a week. In other words, not only would Eric miss the premiere of Toy Story, he might not be able to make it back in time when Terminator 2 was released. The quality of the 2 movies was there, and the publicity work was also being carried out in an orderly manner. So whether he appeared or not, it wouldn't have much impact on the box office of the 2 movies. However, Eric was most concerned about Cutthroat Island, that Disney put in between the 2 movies. At the beginning of May, the highlights of Cutthroat Island had begun to be broadcast on TV. According to the intelligence, the film would complete post-production in mid-June, and there would be no delays. Eric certainly didn't want Cutthroat Island to be delayed. Disney inserted Cutthroat Island between the 2 movies with the purpose of sniping Toy Story and Terminator 2. But Eric knew that Cutthroat Island would be the one to be sniped in the end. He only hoped that Cutthroat Island would be sniped as badly as possible. Chris also sent news from time to time. Now Firefly Investments had used several shell companies in their hands to absorb 7% of Disney's shares. If Cutthroat Island could repeat the tragic situation in the original universe, then with the decline of Disney's stock price, Firefly Investments could take the opportunity to absorb more shares. Because Eric devoted himself to the production of Tornado, he didn't leave Oklahoma for several months. After Virginia, Jennifer Connelly, Elizabeth, and Drew came to visit the set one after another. At the beginning of June, Famke Janssen, who had finished filming Flowers at the End, also appeared on set, but the tall girl only stayed for 2 days before she had to rush back. The new season of The X-Files was about to begin production. After Famke Janssen left, the crew soon welcomed a little lowly. Eric spent $100 to make a guest appearance in 5 movies with Ivanka Trump. There were originally 2 scenes in the script that could be given to the little lowly. One was, of course, the part where the heroine, Jo Harden, was a child. The other was when Jo took a car to her aunt's town that was destroyed by a tornado. She saw the scene where the family of 3 hugged each other. There was also a little girl in the scene. Of course, Ivanka didn't have the right to decide. Eric faxed the scripts of the 2 scenes to Donald Trump in New York. The real estate tycoon who had walked out of the economic crisis finally chose the one with more scenes for his daughter. Chapter 425. Donald Trump had always been a person who liked to be in the limelight, which could be seen from his enthusiasm for playing small roles in Hollywood movies. After choosing the childhood scenes for Ivanka, Donald even wanted to play the role of Joe's father himself. However, Donald Trump's image of a pampered Oklahoma farmer had nothing to do with him. Eric firmly refused his request. However, Donald Trump still personally took Ivanka, who had just finished her summer vacation, to Punk City, Oklahoma. At 8 o'clock in the evening, in a small farm on the outskirts of Punk City, the crew was busy setting up the shooting scene. Eric was sitting in the director's chair, holding a cup of coffee in his hand and chatting casually with Donald Trump, who was sitting next to him. Ivanka was playing with a poodle not far away. This little guy would also participate in the shooting later. Donald looked at his daughter not far away and said casually, "Eric, I heard that the shooting hasn't been going well during this period." Eric recalled the shooting experience of the first 2 months and said, "It's indeed a bit overwhelming. Fortunately, the big scenes are almost finished, and the shooting will be much easier. How about you? How's business recently?" Donald Trump said, "I plan to build a high-rise apartment in Manhattan, and I'm in the process of financing." "Eric, you don't have property in New York yet, right?" Eric thought that Donald should be talking about the famous Trump Tower near the United Nations headquarters in his previous life. He didn't know when the original building was built, but it shouldn't have been so early. It seemed that his appearance had affected a lot of things. Because of some experiences in his previous life, Eric was very uninterested in high-rise apartments, and even somewhat hated them. He preferred standalone buildings. However, after hearing Donald Trump's promotion, Eric didn't refuse. Buying such a high-rise apartment to hide his mistress was also a good choice. "After it's built, I'll go and have a look," Donald Trump just said casually. Eric's answer was almost equivalent to a promise, so they didn't continue the topic. While the two of them were chatting, Ivanka ran over with the puppy. She crouched down and held the puppy in her arms. She looked at Donald Trump expectantly. "Dad, Poke is so good. Can I take him home?" Donald knew that the puppy was a professional animal actor. He said, Poke has to stay here for filming. He can't go home with you." Ivanka did not quite understand what Donald meant. She was displeased to hear her father's answer. Eric joined in the fun and said, This puppy also has an owner. If you want to bring it home, it will cost at least $1,000. Do you have that much money?" Eric didn't know how much this kind of animal actor was worth. He just thought of the little Loli's money-grubbing behavior last year, and casually said a number to see how she would react. Sure enough, Ivanka looked disappointed after hearing Eric's words. She pursed her thin lips and thought to herself, $1,000. That's $1,000. That's $1,000 for a dollar. I can't afford it now. The puppy in her arms seemed to sense Ivanka's disappointment. It very sensibly stuck out its tongue and licked Ivanka's little hand. Sensing Ivanka's love for the puppy, Eric said, "However, if you behave well, I can buy Poke for you." Ivanka was delighted at first, but she soon shook her head. "I don't want it." Eric was a bit surprised. "Why?" "Because my mother told me that when a boy gives a girl something, he must be up to no good. I don't want your gift." Seeing that Ivanka clearly didn't understand the meaning of the sentence, but still looked so serious, Eric and Donald looked at each other and couldn't help but laugh. Seeing that they suddenly laughed, Ivanka put on an angry expression. "You're both bad guys. I'm not going to talk to you anymore." After saying that, Ivanka called the puppy's name and ran off into the distance. An assistant director soon came over to inform Eric that the set was set up. After finishing his coffee, Eric got up and started working. This scene would take about 3 minutes of the entire film, and it was definitely not going to be finished in one night. Fortunately, the little girl was on summer vacation, so there was no need to rush. However, during the shooting, Eric and Ivanka had a small argument. Looking at the teddy bear in her hand, Ivanka complained to Eric, "Why do I have to hold this? I'm going to be 10 years old soon." Of course, Eric couldn't say that it was his bad taste. After Ivanka appeared in Ghost, Eric planned to let her appear as a little girl holding a teddy bear in his future movies, just like the mysterious old man who always appeared and disappeared mysteriously in superhero movies. This is a prop for the movie. Look, it's written in the script." Eric waved the script in front of Ivanka. Obviously, the little girl didn't know that the script could be changed. Seeing that it was written in the script that Chio was holding a teddy bear in her arms, she had no choice but to listen to him obediently. After the shooting started, the shooting went unusually smoothly. Although the little girl was occasionally clumsy, that was only limited by her age. When it came to acting, she was very clever, and even made fewer mistakes than the 2 adult actors who played her parents. It only took 2 nights for the shooting of the part about Chio's childhood to be completed. When she left, Ivanka took the puppy with her. It was common for actors to develop feelings for animal actors during filming, and then adopt the puppy. After Ivanka left, the shooting continued in an orderly manner. Since most of the thrilling scenes had already been shot, the rest of the shooting did not encounter any major issues. In the second week of June, at the Disney headquarters in Los Angeles, an internal screening meeting was being held that attracted a lot of attention. Michael Eisner, Robert Shea, and a group of senior executives of Disney appeared in the screening room. Although the title of the first movie with a budget of more than $100 million had been taken by Terminator 2, Throat Cutter Island was released earlier than Terminator 2. Therefore, this movie, whose budget was also increased to $100 million, received no less attention than Terminator 2. In the screening room, after a brief introduction, the heroine Morgan Adams, played by Gina Davis, first appeared through a simple small reversal, followed by a live aerial shot of the pirate ship. Under the magnificent sea under the sunset, the huge pirate ship anchored on the sea was very beautiful. Next, the heroine boarded the pirate ship. After a series of confrontations with the pirates on the ship, she successfully took over the captain role of her father, and led the pirates to begin the treasure hunt. If Eric was at the scene, he would definitely find that the city chase in the movie was very similar to Pirates of the Caribbean in his memory. Even the costumes, settings, and other pictures in the movie were in the same vein as Pirates of the Caribbean. However, the biggest difference between the two movies was that there were no special effects scenes in Throat Cutter Island. Even the last scene where the two warships fired at each other did not use too many special effects. It was completely shot in real life. But it was precisely because there were no special effects that this big-budget pirate movie seemed to have no highlights. From beginning to end, the 2-hour plot seemed a bit dull. Perhaps because the expectations were too high. After the 2-hour movie was played, not many people in the screening room even applauded. Many people looked at each other because after watching the movie, they didn't feel anything special about this movie. Even the last scene where the two ships fired at each other, for these people who had experienced many war movies, they didn't feel any excitement. Moreover, the process of the heroine's treasure hunt was too dull, and there was no suspense. After the lights in the screening room were turned on, Michael Eisner's face was obviously gloomy. So far, he didn't think that this was a trap dug by Eric. However, it was very bland, and there were no exciting movies. Naturally, he blamed the mistake on Renny Harlin. At this time, although Renny Harlin was the director of the movie, he didn't have the privilege of sitting in the first row. Instead, he sat in the second row with Gina Davis, but he was arranged to sit behind Michael Eisner and Robert Shea. Seeing the reaction of the people in the screening room after the movie was played, Renny Harlin obviously had a bad feeling. He also realized that this movie was too dull. However, Renny Harlin didn't feel that this had much to do with him. Because although he was the director of this movie, as a blockbuster with an investment of $100 million, even if he was the director, he didn't have much authority. Although he participated in the editing of the movie, the final editing rights were not in his hands. Moreover, Renny Harlin originally suggested making this movie an R-rated movie. In that case, many scenes could be more freely played. However, because of the cost, Disney and Robert Shea didn't agree with his suggestion. Instead, they set the movie at a PG-13 rating, which meant that there couldn't be any bloody scenes in the movie. Therefore, the fight between the pirates now looked like a child's play. Michael Eisner really wanted to say what kind of garbage this was, but with so many people here, he couldn't say that. Besides, he fully supported this movie. If Michael Eisner really said that, it would be like slapping himself in the face. After making movies for more than 10 years, Robert Shea had a good eye for movies. At least he had a good taste for movies. Therefore, after watching the movie, Robert Shea had a bad feeling in his heart. So, everyone, what do you think of the movie? What needs to be changed? After everyone moved to the conference room, Michael Eisner was the first to speak. More than 10 people in the conference room looked at each other. Those who could climb to the top had a good judgment of the movie's box office prospects. After watching the movie, the executives basically judged that the movie didn't have many highlights, and that the conflict wasn't strong enough. At this time, no one was willing to speak first. If they said something wrong and the movie failed, they might be blamed in the future. There was an awkward silence for a full minute. Michael Eisner frowned slightly and said directly to Rennie Harlin, who was sitting on his right, "Mr. Harlin, why don't you speak first?" Michael Eisner had always called him Rennie. Hearing that he had changed the way he addressed him now, Rennie Harlin was very depressed. However, since Michael Eisner directly called him out, he couldn't play dumb. "Mr. Eisner, I don't think there's any need to change it. The final version is pretty good." Rennie Harlin deliberately bit the words "final version." He just wanted to remind everyone that this version had nothing to do with him, because his shooting concept hadn't been thoroughly reflected at all. Everyone present was smart. How could they not understand the meaning of Rennie Harlin's words? Several people sneered. What was the use of saying this now? If this movie with a production cost of $100 million failed, Rennie Harlin, the director, wouldn't be able to survive in Hollywood. Noticing the expressions of some people, Rennie Harlin also realized this and his face became a little ugly. Robert Shea only spent $50 million on this movie, including the publicity. At this time, he was a little glad that he only got 40% of the investment share. However, Robert Shea didn't want to see his $50 million go down the drain. Moreover, as an outsider, he didn't have too many scruples. After Rennie Harlin finished speaking, Robert Shea said, "How about we postpone it?" Hearing this, the atmosphere in the conference room became cold again. Since no one was willing to speak, Michael Eisner had to bite the bullet and said, "When should we postpone it? At the end of the year, or next year?" The original release date of Cutthroat Island was June 28th. The summer vacation had already begun. If it was postponed at this time, it would be impossible to put it in August at the end of the summer vacation. What's more, Disney had signed a contract with the cinema chain for the premiere of 2,500 theaters. Because of the Gulf War at the beginning of the year, major studios had reduced the production scale. If Cutthroat Island was postponed, Disney couldn't even come up with a replacement film, and could only pay a high penalty for breach of contract. Moreover, the postponement of the movie would definitely make outsiders doubt the quality of Cutthroat Island. Although many film companies' reasons for changing the movie schedule were always high-sounding, in fact, most people in the industry knew that if a completed movie suddenly changed its schedule, there must be a major problem with the quality of the movie. In the end, Michael Eisner's deputy, Disney's president Frank Wales, said, "The risk of the movie being postponed is greater, so it's best to release it as planned." Michael Eisner glanced at the senior executive of the distribution department and said, "In this case, the distribution plan must be changed. Clark, tell us first." According to the plan, after the internal test, the critics' test screening and the audience's pre-screening of Cutthroat Island would be arranged, as well as the final premiere. But now everyone had no confidence in the quality of the movie. In order to prevent a one-sided bad review before the movie was released, the large-scale test screening and pre-screening would definitely not be carried out. You're tuning in to the Earbook Haven YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.